Close your eyes and imagine justice not in courts, but in fire, not in reason, but in rivers, not in law, but in blood. In the medieval world, crimes were judged not by evidence, but by ordeal. The accused were thrown into icy waters to see if the waves would accept or reject them. They were forced to clutch red-hot irons, their flesh seared as the crowd waited for God's verdict. And when disputes could not be settled with words, they were dragged into brutal duels where only one survivor could claim righteousness. These trials were not just punishments, they were rituals, staged spectacles of suffering that mixed faith, fear, and violence into a single twisted form of justice. To the people of the Middle Ages, pain was truth, survival was innocence, and death was divine judgment. Tonight, on Forgotten Slumber, we descend into the chilling history of trial by fire, water, and combat. A world where torture was a path to truth, where fear ruled communities, and where the line between faith and cruelty blurred into shadows. Let the darkness unfold. Let the whispers of the past guide you. And as always, if you wish to keep wandering through these haunted echoes of history, subscribe to Forgotten Slumber and press the bell icon, because the next tale will be waiting just beyond the silence. Chapter 1: Shadows of Justice. An Introduction to Ordeals. The Middle Ages were a time when justice was not merely a matter of courts, laws, and reasoned arguments. Justice was, above all else, a matter of faith. To understand how societies of the past judged right from wrong, guilt from innocence, and truth from lies, we must first step into a world where human judgment was often mistrusted, and divine judgment was seen as the only certainty. The medieval world was filled with uncertainty. Plague, famine, and war could strike without warning. A bad harvest might destroy a village. A sudden illness might claim an entire family. Fortune was fragile, and survival was rarely guaranteed. In such a world, where chaos always seemed close at hand, people longed for certainty, for a system that could reveal truth when human senses failed. This longing gave birth to ordeals, rituals of judgment designed to allow God to decide the outcome of disputes. An ordeal was not seen as cruelty or superstition in its time. Instead, it was seen as the fairest form of judgment available. Human judges could be bribed, deceived, or swayed by politics. Witnesses could lie. Evidence could be tampered with. But God, it was believed, could never be tricked. If a man was guilty, the fire would burn him, the water would reject him, or the duel would defeat him. If he was innocent, divine protection would shield him. In this belief lay both the logic and the terror of the ordeal. Imagine, for a moment, standing in a medieval village square. The crowd gathers, whispering prayers under their breath. The accused is led forward, trembling, yet defiant. Perhaps he is charged with theft, perhaps with blasphemy, perhaps with murder. His fate will not be decided by lawyers or juries. Instead, the priest raises his hand to bless the trial. The ordeal will begin, and in the flames or waters, the will of God will be revealed. The very word ordeal comes from the Old English word ordeal, meaning judgment. It was not considered punishment, at least not in its original form. It was a test, an opportunity for God to show his hand. And so, ordeals became woven into the very fabric of medieval justice. But to truly understand ordeals, we must first understand the mindset of the age. For medieval people, the natural and supernatural were not separate. The weather, the growth of crops, the birth of a child, all were tied to divine will. To them, it made perfect sense that God would intervene in trials. Why would he not? If he could send rain or withhold it, if he could grant victory in battle or defeat, surely he could also protect the innocent and punish the guilty. This way of thinking may seem strange to us now, but to the medieval mind, it was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting, because it promised that justice was never beyond reach. Terrifying, because it meant one's fate rested not in persuasion or evidence, but in the mysterious will of the divine. The earliest ordeals were simple, yet powerful in symbolism. Fire, with its purifying flame, was often used to test guilt or innocence. Water, with its sacred associations of baptism and cleansing, could reveal truth as well. Combat, with sword and shield, placed judgment into the hands of God, who was believed to grant victory to the righteous. These trials became known collectively as ordeals by God, or judicium Dei, the judgment of the Lord. The medieval mind. Ordeals were not merely about crime. They were about order. They preserved harmony within communities by removing doubt. A dispute that might have torn a village apart could be resolved by trial. A question that divided families could be answered by ordeal. The verdict, once given, was final. For who could question the judgment of God? At the heart of these ordeals was ritual. They were not random acts of cruelty, but carefully structured ceremonies. Priests blessed the tools of judgment, whether fire, water, or weapon. Prayers were spoken, invoking divine presence. The ordeal was carried out with solemnity, for it was believed that the eyes of heaven were watching. The crowd, silent and anxious, bore witness, and the result was interpreted as divine truth. Consider the ordeal of hot iron. The accused was required to carry a piece of red-hot iron a certain number of paces. His hand was then bound and sealed by the priest. After several days, the bandages were removed. If the wound had healed cleanly, the accused was declared innocent. If infection festered, guilt was confirmed. The wound itself was thought to reveal whether God had intervened to protect the innocent or think of the ordeal by water. The accused was bound and cast into a pond or river. If he sank, he was considered innocent, for the waters had received him. If he floated, he was guilty, rejected by the purity of holy water. To us, this may seem cruelly arbitrary. To them, it was proof that God's creation itself could reveal truth. Trial by combat. 2. Carried a solemn weight. Disputes between nobles or accusations without witnesses could be resolved by fighting. Each man believed that victory would come only through divine favor. Even women could sometimes appoint champions to fight on their behalf. The duel was not seen as violence, but as sacred arbitration, a holy battle where God himself chose the victor. It is important to remember that ordeals were not unique to Europe. Cultures across the world, from ancient India to Africa, developed similar rituals where fire, water, or combat revealed truth. Yet in medieval Europe, ordeals reached a unique intensity. Deeply entwined with the Christian faith and the authority of the Church, by the 11th and 12th centuries. Ordeals had become widespread across the continent. From small villages to great cities, from peasants to kings, all might be subjected to divine judgment. Chronicles from the period tell stories of miracles. Men unharmed by boiling water, women vindicated after duels, criminals exposed by the flame. To medieval people, these stories were not exaggerations but affirmations that God's justice was real and active in their world. And yet, behind this trust in divine judgment lay fear. Few wished to undergo an ordeal, for the uncertainty was terrible. To carry hot iron, to face a duel, to risk drowning. These were not trials undertaken lightly. The very threat of an ordeal was often enough to extract confessions or settlements. The ordeal was as much a tool of deterrence as it was of justice. The Church, too, played a central role. Priests oversaw ordeals, blessed the instruments, and interpreted results. The rituals were sanctified by liturgy, binding the process to sacred authority. To question the ordeal was to question the Church, and to question the Church was to question God. Thus, ordeals served both legal and spiritual purposes, reinforcing the union of faith and justice. But ordeals were never without their critics. Some doubted whether God truly intervened in such trials. Others feared that human corruption tainted the process. Could not a biased priest manipulate results? Could not wounds heal differently depending on the strength or health of the accused? These questions lingered, though they rarely weakened the faith of the common people. Over time, ordeals grew more elaborate. The rituals surrounding them became increasingly codified, with detailed instructions on how each should be conducted. Kings and councils issued laws describing when ordeals should be used and how results should be judged. What began as a sacred test gradually became a formal institution. A cornerstone of medieval LAWS, we begin our journey through the history of trial by fire, water, and combat. Let us keep in mind that ordeals were not mere curiosities of the past. They were reflections of a worldview, one in which the divine was ever present, and human life was constantly measured against the will of God. For the medieval mind, ordeals offered clarity in a world of shadows, certainty in a world of doubt. They were, in their own way, the shadows of justice, cast long across the centuries that in the chapters to come. We will explore these ordeals in detail. We will walk through the flames, plunge into the waters, and stand in the field of combat. We will examine the stories, the rituals, the fears, and the hopes that define this unique system of justice. And as we drift deeper into the history of ordeals, we may find ourselves not only learning about the past, but also reflecting on humanity's timeless search for truth. For now, as the night grows quiet, imagine the hush of a medieval courtroom, the flicker of torches casting shadows on stone walls, the solemn chant of priests preparing for judgment. Somewhere in the silence, a man or woman stands trembling, waiting for the ordeal to begin. The crowd watches, breath held. The moment of truth approaches, and with it, the shadow of justice. Chapter 2. The Roots of Ordeal, Ancient Traditions. Before the Middle Ages clothed ordeals in Christian ritual and wrapped them in the chants of priests. Their roots stretched far deeper into the soil of human history. To understand how trial by fire, water, and combat became such a central feature of medieval justice, we must travel backward through time, back to the dawn of civilization, where fire and water were not only elements of nature but instruments of truth. Justice, in every age, has sought certainty. Long before courts, codified laws, or professional judges, communities faced disputes, crimes, and accusations. Who stole the grain? Who told the truth? Who bore guilt for a sudden death? Without evidence, without impartial institutions, how could they decide? For ancient peoples, the answer was clear. The gods themselves must decide. And so, ordeals were born as bridges between the human and the divine. Across continents, one finds echoes of ordeals, strikingly similar tests of truth, devised independently by cultures who never knew of each other. Fire, water, poison, combat, and sacred oaths were employed as ways of uncovering guilt. To us, they may seem brutal or superstitious, but to those who lived in these early worlds, ordeals were not cruelty. They were fairness. They were faith in action. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of the cradles of civilization, the waters of the Euphrates and Tigris carried not only life, but also judgment. The Code of Hammurabi, carved into stone nearly 4,000 years ago, makes reference to a ritual that resembles trial by water. If a man was accused of a crime he denied, he could be cast into the river. If he drowned, guilt was confirmed. If he survived, the gods had saved him, and innocence was declared. The river was sacred, a divine witness, and to entrust judgment to it was to entrust judgment to the gods themselves. In India, too, water and fire were wielded as instruments of truth. The ancient texts known as the Dharmasastras describe ordeals in extraordinary detail. The accused might be required to plunge a hand into boiling oil, grasp a hot iron ball, or retrieve a stone from deep water. The outcome, burns or lack thereof, survival or failure, revealed the verdict. These trials were solemn, often preceded by prayers, offerings, and purification rites. The gods, it was believed, would intervene directly to protect the innocent. Africa and the Americas had their own traditions of ordeal. In West Africa, particularly among the Yoruba and other peoples, trial by poison was practiced. A bitter drink, often made from the bark of trees, was given to the accused. If he vomited it up, he was considered innocent. If he died, guilt was confirmed. To the communities who practiced it, this was not random chance. It was the gods at work, revealing truth through the body's reaction. The Norse peoples, ancestors of medieval Europeans, also trusted in sacred tests. Oaths sworn on holy relics or weapons carried immense weight, for to break an oath was to call down divine wrath. Combat, too, was a means of judgment. The duel, or holmgang, was more than a fight. It was a sacred trial, a chance for the gods to show favor. Victory was innocence, defeat was guilt, and honor was preserved in the process. Even among the ancient Hebrews, ordeals appear. In the book of Numbers, the ordeal of bitter water is described, in which a woman accused of adultery was made to drink a mixture prepared by a priest. If she became ill, guilt was assumed. If not, she was declared innocent. Such rituals remind us that ordeal was not confined to one culture or faith, but was a nearly universal human response to the problem of uncertainty. What ties these traditions together is not the specific element, whether water, fire, or poison, but the belief behind them, that human justice was incomplete without divine confirmation. Where human witnesses failed, the gods themselves must speak. And so, the elements of the world, the very forces of nature, became judges in the great courtroom of existence, by the time Christianity spread across Europe. These ancient ideas were already deeply ingrained in human consciousness. The Church did not invent ordeals. It inherited them. What it did was sanctify them, clothing them in liturgy and binding them to Christian theology. The river became holy water, the fire was blessed with prayers, and the duel was framed as a battlefield where God decided truth. The continuity between ancient and medieval is clear. Ordeals were humanity's oldest tool for seeking certainty when certainty could not otherwise be found. It is worth pausing to reflect on why ordeals appealed so powerfully to human societies. Part of the reason lies in their drama. Ordeals were not hidden, quiet judgments. They were spectacles, visible to the community. When a man plunged his arm into boiling water or faced a rival in combat, the entire village could see justice unfold before their eyes. There was no secrecy, no ambiguity. The result, whether survival or defeat, was plain for all to witness. In a world where rumor and suspicion could tear communities apart, this clarity was invaluable. Another reason lies in psychology. To undergo an ordeal was terrifying. Many confessed before the trial even began, unwilling to risk the fire or water. In this way, ordeals functioned as deterrents, extracting truth, or at least submission, without the need for actual judgment. Even if one doubted divine intervention, the ordeal worked by instilling fear, and fear itself preserved order. But perhaps the deepest reason lies in faith. For ancient peoples, the divine was ever present, guiding every aspect of life. To turn to the gods in times of doubt was not desperation, but logic. Ordeals were not merely tests of guilt. They were acts of devotion, demonstrations of faith, opportunities for the divine to show power in the world of as centuries passed. Ordeals spread and adapted. In some places, the river judged. In others, fire. In others, combat. Each culture shaped the ordeal according to its environment and its gods. Yet always, the principle remained the same. the divine must decide, when the Roman Empire expanded across Europe. It brought with it a more formal system of law, based on evidence, witnesses, and legal reasoning. Yet even in Rome, ordeals survived on the fringes, especially among conquered peoples who clung to their traditions. And when Rome collapsed and the medieval world began to emerge, ordeals flourished once again, reborn in the soil of faith, fear, and necessity. The early medieval centuries, sometimes called the Dark Ages, were a time of fragmentation and uncertainty. Kings were weak, laws varied from place to place, and communities often had to police themselves. In this environment, ordeals provided stability. They were tools that everyone understood, respected, and feared. The Church, seeing their power, embraced them, binding them to Christian ritual. The result was a fusion of ancient tradition and medieval faith, a system of justice that seemed to reach beyond the human and into the divine. And so, when we hear of trial by fire in a medieval village, or trial by combat in a castle courtyard, we are not hearing of something new. We are hearing the echoes of Mesopotamia's rivers, of India's boiling oil, of Africa's bitter poison, of Norse duels beneath the cold sky. We are hearing humanity's oldest cry, "Let the gods decide." The ordeals of the Middle Ages, then, were not isolated curiosities. They were the flowering of an ancient tree whose roots stretched across civilizations and centuries. In them, we see the continuity of human fear, human faith, and human longing for certainty as the night deepens. Imagine the riverbanks of Mesopotamia, where accused men once struggled in the current. Picture the fire altars of India, where hands were plunged into flame. Hear the clash of Norse swords in lonely fields, the chants of priests in Hebrew temples, the cries of villagers in Africa. All of these echoes converge, flowing forward into the Middle Ages, shaping the ordeals that would define an era. And so, as we step forward into the chapters ahead, let us remember this truth. Ordeals were never merely punishments. They were rituals, sacred bridges between earth and heaven. They were the ancestors of medieval justice, born in fire, water, and combat, carried forward by faith, and remembered even now in the shadows of history. Chapter 3, Trial by Fire. Flames of Judgment. In the medieval imagination, fire was more than an element. It was the breath of God, the devourer of impurity, the purifier of souls. To stand before fire was to stand before judgment itself. From ancient tradition through the Middle Ages, trial by fire became one of the most feared and revered ordeals, a test in which innocence or guilt was revealed not by human hands, but by the sacred flame. The use of fire as a divine judge carried deep symbolic weight. In Christian theology, fire was associated with both punishment and purification. The fires of hell threatened sinners with eternal torment, while the flames of purgatory promised cleansing for the penitent. In Scripture, fire descended from heaven to consume Elijah's sacrifice, proving the prophet's favor before God. In this world of symbolism, to undergo trial by fire was to place oneself entirely in the hands of divine power, with life, reputation, and soul hanging in the balance. The ritual of fire in its most common medieval form. Trial by fire required the accused to undergo one of several ordeals. The simplest involved carrying a piece of red-hot iron, often weighing several pounds, for a prescribed number of steps. Another variant required the accused to plunge a bare hand into flames or hold it over a burning fire. Sometimes, the ordeal involved walking barefoot across glowing embers. The process was anything but chaotic. It was ritualized, structured, and solemn. The accused would first spend days in fasting, prayer, and sometimes seclusion, as priests prepared their soul for judgment. On the day itself, the ordeal began in the church. Mass was celebrated, holy water was sprinkled, and relics were brought forth. The hot iron was consecrated, the fire blessed, and the accused swore an oath of innocence. Only then would the trial proceed. After the ordeal, the wound was carefully bandaged by clerics, sealed, and left untouched for 3 days. On the appointed day, the bandages were removed in the presence of witnesses. If the wound showed signs of healing, the accused was declared innocent. If festering or infected, guilt was confirmed. In this way, divine intervention was read through the language of the body, with priests serving as interpreters of God's judgment. Fire in symbol and belief. Why fire? In part, because it was absolute. Fire could not be reasoned with or bribed. It consumed or it spared, burned or purified. In the minds of medieval people, if God wished to protect the innocent, he could prevent the flesh from being consumed. If guilt was present, the fire would reveal it, leaving no doubt. But fire also carried moral symbolism. To touch fire and remain unburned was to mirror the miracles of saints and prophets. Stories of holy men walking unharmed through flames reinforced the idea that innocence and faith could command divine protection. For ordinary people, trial by fire was not simply a test of guilt, but a participation in this sacred tradition, a chance for God to demonstrate his will through miraculous preservation. Famous cases of trial by fire history records numerous instances where fire was invoked as judge. One of the most famous is that of Queen Emma of Normandy, mother of Edward the Confessor. Accused of adultery in the 11th century, she was ordered to walk barefoot across red-hot plowshares. According to legend, she crossed the glowing blades without injury, proving her innocence and restoring her honor. Whether the event occurred precisely as told is uncertain, but the story reflects the deep belief in fire's power to reveal truth. Another tale concerns the Hungarian king, Charles I of Anjou, who in the 14th century faced accusations of murder. To prove his innocence, he is said to have undergone an ordeal of fire, grasping heated iron before the eyes of the court. His survival and apparent lack of injury confirmed his legitimacy, silencing his enemies. These stories, whether fully true or embellished by chroniclers, illustrate the cultural role of fire. Ordeals were not only legal procedures, but narratives of legitimacy, honor, and divine favor. To survive fire was to be vindicated not merely before men, but before God, and to fail was to be condemned in both realms. The fear of fire for ordinary people, however, trial by fire was terrifying. Few could hope to endure red-hot iron without harm, and many confessed rather than face the ordeal. In this sense, the ritual worked as much by psychological pressure as by actual test. The fear of fire was itself a deterrent, extracting admissions of guilt or submission before the trial even began. Yet the ordeal also functioned as theater. Gathered crowds witnessed the accused lift glowing iron, step across embers, or plunge a hand into flame. The drama of the act impressed itself upon memory, reinforcing the power of law and the majesty of divine judgment. Even if many believed the outcome inevitable, the spectacle itself was a form of communal reassurance. Justice was seen, justice was done. Clerical control. The church's role in trial by fire was crucial. Priests consecrated the fire, oversaw the ritual, and interpreted the wounds. Without their blessing, the ordeal was meaningless. This gave the clergy enormous influence, allowing them to shape outcomes, protect allies, or condemn enemies under the guise of divine judgment. While the official stance was that God alone decided, human hands often guided the process. Some historians have suggested that priests may have subtly aided the innocent by cooling the iron, shortening the distance to be walked, or applying healing salves during the 3-day bandaging period. In this way, outcomes could be steered to match political needs, preserving the appearance of divine justice while ensuring practical control. Decline of fire ordeals. By the 13th century, however, trial by fire began to wane. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 forbade priests from participating in ordeals, effectively removing the Church's sanction. Without clerical blessing, fire lost its sacred authority. Slowly, secular courts replaced ordeals with more rational forms of evidence, testimony, documents, and, eventually, jury trials. Yet even as fire's role declined, its memory remained powerful. Legends of miraculous survivals continued to circulate, and stories of saints untouched by flame reinforced the symbolism of divine protection. Trial by fire faded as a legal practice, but its echoes remained in folklore, chronicles, and the imagination of later generations. Fire as legacy. The legacy of trial by fire lies not only in its historical practice, but in its enduring metaphor. To this day, we speak of trial by fire to describe any severe test of courage or ability. The phrase carries with it the same weight as in the Middle Ages, the idea that truth and strength are revealed only when exposed to heat, danger, and judgment. For medieval people, trial by fire was more than justice, it was revelation. In the heat of glowing iron, they saw not merely punishment, but divine decision. Fire was God's language, and wounds were his words. To live through fire was to be vindicated. To burn was to be condemned. Closing reflection as you rest and drift deeper into the stories of this age. Imagine the glow of embers in a darkened church, the hiss of iron pulled from the flame, the solemn silence as the accused stretches out a trembling hand. Hear the collective breath of the crowd, the prayers of priests, the sharp crackle of fire echoing through stone halls. This was justice in the Middle Ages, absolute, terrifying, and sacred. Trial by fire was not only a test of flesh, but of faith. A drama where human fear and divine power met in the glowing light of judgment. And though the fire has long since cooled, its memory lingers, a reminder of how deeply humanity once trusted the elements to speak the truth of guilt and innocence. Chapter 4. Trial by Water. The Depths of Judgment. Water has always held a paradoxical role in human thought. It sustains life, cleanses impurity, and baptizes the faithful into new beginnings. Yet it also destroys, drowns, and conceals within its depths. In the medieval imagination, this dual nature of water made it a perfect tool for divine judgment. Just as fire could purify or consume, water could reveal innocence or expose guilt. The ordeal of water was among the most dramatic of the medieval trials. To submit to its test was to surrender to an element as old as creation itself, an element that could cradle or reject, cleanse or condemn. To float or sink was not merely a physical phenomenon. It was seen as a verdict spoken by God through nature's voice. The symbolism of water from the earliest days of Christianity, water was holy. Baptism washed away sin and marked entry into the community of the faithful. Pilgrims traveled to sacred springs to drink or bathe, believing in healing miracles. Monks recorded visions of rivers dividing heaven from hell. Yet alongside these life-giving associations, water also bore menace. The flood of Genesis destroyed all but Noah and his family. The Red Sea drowned Pharaoh's armies. In Revelation, seas roared with judgment. Water was both gift and punishment, blessing and curse. Medieval ordeals drew upon this layered symbolism. To place an accused person in water was to call upon its power as a witness of truth. Did the water embrace and cleanse the body, welcoming it as innocent? Or did it reject the guilty, forcing them to float upon its surface like oil upon wine? Forms of trial by water. There were two main forms of trial by water: cold water ordeal and hot water ordeal. The cold water ordeal. The cold water ordeal was the more common and infamous. The accused was bound, sometimes hand and foot, sometimes with a rope tied around the waist, and lowered into a body of water, often a river or a specially prepared pool, if the accused sank. The water was believed to accept them, proving innocence. Attendants were usually ready to pull the accused out quickly before drowning. If the accused floated, the water was said to reject them as guilty. The logic seems inverted to modern ears. But in medieval thought, the reasoning was clear. Water, as a holy element used in baptism, rejected the sinful. Innocence allowed the body to sink into its depths, while guilt made it buoyant, lifted and cast off by the purifying liquid. The hot water ordeal. The hot water ordeal was similar in ritual to trial by fire. A cauldron of water was heated to boiling, and within it was placed a stone, ring, or other small object. The accused was required to plunge a bare arm into the boiling water and retrieve the item with the fire ordeal. The arm was then bandaged and examined after 3 days. A cleanly healing wound suggested innocence, while festering burns indicated guilt. Though less spectacular than the cold water ordeal, hot water trials were still terrifying. Few could escape scalding unharmed, making divine protection appear as the only hope. Ritual and solemnity, both forms of water ordeal, were surrounded by religious ceremony. Priests consecrated the water, invoking the Holy Trinity and often sprinkling salt or holy oil upon the surface. In many accounts, exorcisms were performed, ensuring that no demonic presence interfered with God's judgment. The accused swore oaths of innocence, sometimes upon relics of saints. Mass was celebrated, prayers chanted, and the crowd gathered in reverent silence. The ordeal was not a crude drowning but a sacred drama in which water itself became the mouthpiece of divine justice. Water and witchcraft in later centuries, especially during the height of witch trials in the early modern period. The cold water ordeal became infamous as a test for witchcraft. Accused witches were bound and cast into rivers or ponds. Those who floated were declared guilty of sorcery, while those who sank were deemed innocent, often tragically drowning before rescue. This practice, though remembered most vividly in the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, had deep medieval roots. The idea that water rejected the guilty aligned perfectly with the belief that witches, as servants of the devil, were cut off from baptismal grace. To float upon water was to reveal their alienation from the holy. Yet, even in witch trials, the ritual was not mere superstition. It was a continuation of centuries of tradition, an inheritance of medieval belief in elemental judgment. Stories of the ordeal chronicles preserve dramatic accounts of water ordeals. In the 9th century, the Saxon nobleman Theodoric was accused of treason. Lowered into water, he sank like a stone, and his innocence was proclaimed. In contrast, a tale from Germany tells of a woman accused of poisoning her husband. When subjected to the cold water ordeal, she floated upon the surface despite her struggles, and the crowd declared her guilty. She was executed shortly after. Such stories reinforced belief in the ordeal's power. Each outcome, whether sinking or floating, confirmed the community's trust that God was actively revealing the truth, fear, and practical realities. Yet the ordeal was not without its critics. Even in the Middle Ages, some questioned its fairness. Couldn't the natural buoyancy of certain bodies cause floating? Couldn't fear or the tightness of binding influence results? Indeed, modern science shows that human buoyancy depends on lung capacity, body fat, and position in water. A panicked person holding breath might float. A calmer or denser body might sink. In this sense, the ordeal could be swayed by chance or by the skill of those overseeing the ritual. But for medieval communities, such explanations were unnecessary. The result was interpreted not through physics, but through theology. The outcome was God's will, read through the movement of the body in water. The decline of water trials, as with trial by fire, the Lateran Council of 1215 dealt a blow to the water ordeal. By forbidding clergy from participating, the Church removed its blessing, and secular courts began to abandon the practice. Over time, The ordeal gave way to more rational forms of legal proof. Yet the cold water ordeal, particularly, proved stubborn. In remote villages and during periods of heightened fear, especially in witch hunts, it resurfaced again and again. Its symbolism too powerful to disappear entirely. Even as late as the 17th century, rivers and ponds became stages for such trials, watched by fearful crowds convinced they were witnessing God's judgment upon witches and criminals. Legacy of the water ordeal today. The water ordeal lingers in cultural memory, often through the lens of witch trials. The image of a bound woman cast into a river has become a haunting symbol of superstition and injustice. Yet behind this image lies a much older and deeper tradition, one that viewed water not as an enemy, but as a divine mirror. For medieval people, water was alive with meaning. To enter its depths was to enter into dialogue with God. To sink was to be embraced by purity. To float was to be cast away as unclean. The ordeal was terrifying, yes, but it was also profoundly sacred. A ritual that united law, faith, and nature into a single act of judgment. Closing reflection as you let your mind drift. Picture the stillness of a river at dawn, mist curling over its surface. A crowd gathers on the banks, holding their breath as the accused is lowered into the water. The ropes tighten, the surface ripples, and the body either sinks or floats. The silence is broken by gasps, cries, or prayers as the verdict is revealed. For those who lived in the Middle Ages, such scenes were not mere superstition but truth revealed through the elements. Fire spoke with heat, and water spoke with depth. Both were languages of God, both instruments of justice. Tonight, as you rest, imagine that ancient faith, a world where even the rivers and flames themselves held voices, where guilt and innocence were written not in human words, but in the movement of nature itself. Chapter 5. Trial by Combat. The sword of judgment. In the shadowed courts and sunlit arenas of medieval Europe, justice was sometimes determined not by words, laws, or witnesses, but by steel. Trial by combat, also known as judicial duel, was a method of resolving disputes and proving innocence through battle. It was a form of law entwined with honor, faith, and the belief that God would intervene on the side of the righteous. The sword, the axe, and the spear were not merely weapons of war. They were instruments of divine judgment. In a world where words could be twisted and witnesses bribed or coerced, the duel offered a visceral certainty. Strength, skill, and courage would speak for truth. The combatants' bodies became the vessels through which God's will was revealed, and the outcome was interpreted as divine affirmation or condemnation. Origins and belief. Trial by combat originated in the early medieval period, influenced by Germanic and Frankish traditions. Among the Franks, legal disputes could be settled by single combat, often in the presence of witnesses, judges, and clergy. The underlying assumption was simple: God would not allow an innocent person to be defeated unjustly. Victory in battle was proof of righteousness. Defeat indicated guilt. This belief was rooted in both pagan and Christian thought. In pre-Christian Germanic law, physical prowess often determined social status and justice. With the Christianization of Europe, these duels were sanctified with ritual and religious oversight, blending the martial and the spiritual into a single act of judgment. Types of judicial duels. There were several variations of trial by combat. Some disputes involved private individuals, where two parties sought to resolve property conflicts, accusations of theft, or claims of slander. Others involved accused criminals, particularly in cases where evidence was insufficient or witnesses were unreliable. Single combat. In single combat, two combatants, often armed with swords, shields, and occasionally spears, faced one another on a designated field. The duel could continue until one party was killed, incapacitated, or surrendered. Clerics often blessed the weapons, invoked prayers, and marked boundaries to ensure fairness. Champions sometimes. The accused or the claimant was unable or unwilling to fight. In such cases, a champion could be appointed to fight on their behalf. These champions were skilled warriors, bound by oaths of loyalty and honor. Their success reflected upon the party they represented, turning personal combat into a proxy for justice. Group combat, though rarer. Group combats occurred in some regions, particularly in feudal disputes involving entire households or clans. These battles were regulated, ritualized, and observed by witnesses to ensure that the outcome was considered legitimate. Rituals and formalities. Trial by combat was never a simple fight. It was a ceremony imbued with symbolism and ritual. The combatants often fasted or prayed before the duel, seeking divine favor. Clerics blessed the weapons and called upon saints to witness and judge. Boundaries were marked, sometimes with chalk or ropes, and the crowd was assembled to observe. Every aspect of the duel had meaning. The armor protected the body, but the hands remained instruments of God's will. The blows were not just physical. They were moral, spiritual, and legal expressions. The fight was a conversation between human courage and divine judgment. Social implications. Participation in trial by combat was closely tied to status, wealth, and gender. Nobles and knights were expected to fight, demonstrating their honor, loyalty, and valor. For commoners, combat was more dangerous, as lack of training often meant certain defeat. Yet, even peasants could participate in some forms of duel, particularly when champions were allowed. The duel also served as a social spectacle. Crowds gathered to witness justice enacted in a direct, tangible way. The clash of steel, the cries of combatants, and the tension of life or death stakes created a powerful sense of communal investment in the outcome. Justice was public, immediate, and dramatic, a lesson visible to all. Famous trials by combat. Historical records recount many dramatic duels. In England, the 13th century saw disputes between knights resolved by judicial combat overseen by the king himself. In France, duels over property or honor could attract entire villages, each citizen watching as God's judgment unfolded in a flurry of sword strokes. One famous duel involved Jean de Courreges and Jacques Legris in the late 14th century. Accused of assault, Legris faced Courreges in front of the French king and a large crowd. The duel was a matter of honor, legal resolution, and divine judgment all at once. Courreges emerged victorious, and Legris was executed, his guilt thus confirmed by both law and combat. Weapons and armor. The choice of weapon and armor was crucial in trial by combat. Swords were the most common, symbolizing justice and valor. Axes, maces, and spears were also used depending on the combatant's preference, skill, and local custom. Armor protected the body but left the face and hands vulnerable in some traditions, emphasizing courage and exposing weakness. Shields were not just defensive. They symbolized the bearer's integrity and honor. The duel was a test of skill, strategy, and divine favor combined. The role of the clerics played an essential role in ensuring the duel was legitimate. Their blessing was seen as indispensable. A duel without spiritual sanction might not be recognized as valid. Priests also observed the combat to ensure adherence to ritual and morality. Their presence reinforced the notion that trial by combat was not mere brawling, but an extension of divine judgment, risks, and realities. Though the trial was idealized as a means for God to reveal truth, it was inherently dangerous. Death or permanent injury was common. Even victory might be Pyrrhic, as wounds could lead to infection or later disability. Despite these risks, the duel offered an alternative to more arbitrary forms of justice, such as torture or public execution. In a sense, it gave the accused a chance to prove innocence through courage and skill. Appealing to both divine authority and human respect, Decline of the practice. By the late medieval period, trial by combat began to decline. Legal systems became more sophisticated, evidence was given greater weight, and torture or ordeals were gradually curtailed by royal and papal decrees. The rise of written law, professional judges, and bureaucratic courts offered alternatives that were less deadly and more predictable. Yet in some regions, particularly in rural areas, the tradition lingered. Even as the Renaissance brought new forms of governance, echoes of the sword's judgment persisted, leaving a legacy in literature, folklore, and cultural imagination. Symbolism and legacy. Trial by combat remains a vivid symbol of medieval justice, combining law, faith, and spectacle. It demonstrates a worldview in which physical courage was inseparable from moral integrity, and where divine judgment could manifest through the mortal hand. Even today, the concept resonates in stories of duels, honor, and courtroom drama. The sword becomes not just a weapon, but a metaphor for fairness, truth, and the sometimes brutal means by which society sought to balance justice. Closing reflection. Imagine the sun glinting on armor, the tension of spectators, the echo of steel against steel. Each strike is a question, each parry an answer. The air is heavy with anticipation, the smell of sweat, leather, and iron. Every movement carries weight, the fate of the accused, the satisfaction of the law, and the witness of heaven itself. Trial by combat was more than violence. It was a conversation between man, law, and God. It reminds us that justice, in the Middle Ages, was not always written in ink, but forged in steel, blood, and faith. As you drift in this story, imagine the clash of blades, the hush of the crowd, and the moment when truth is revealed not in a verdict from a judge, but in the swing of a sword and the judgment of the divine. Chapter 6. Trial by Fire. Flames of Judgment. In the flickering light of medieval halls and sacred courtyards, another form of divine justice emerged, the trial by fire. Unlike duels where swords and shields tested skill and courage, here, the very elements of the natural world, heat, flame, and burning coals, became instruments of judgment. In an era when evidence could be disputed and witnesses were often unreliable, fire was seen as a pure and impartial arbiter, a medium through which God's will could be revealed. The essence of the trial by fire lay in the belief that divine power would protect the innocent and punish the guilty. To place one's hand in boiling water, to walk over scorching coals, or to carry a heated iron was to submit oneself to God's judgment. Survival or minimal injury was considered proof of innocence, while burns, pain, or incapacitation signaled guilt. In a world where human law was imperfect, fire became the ultimate test, burning away deception and revealing the truth in a tangible, terrifying, and irrevocable form. Origins and philosophy. The roots of the trial by fire trace back to early medieval Europe and even earlier Germanic and Celtic customs. Fire has always held symbolic power. It purifies, it destroys, and it illuminates. In judicial contexts, fire represented both the wrath and the mercy of God. Early societies believed that natural forces could manifest divine judgment, and fire was a particularly potent symbol. The ordeal was as much spiritual as it was physical, embodying the medieval understanding of law, morality, and faith. It transformed the abstract concept of justice into a sensory, visceral experience that demanded both courage and trust in divine oversight. Methods and variations. The trial by fire was not uniform across Europe. It took on many forms depending on local custom, severity of accusation, and available materials. Hot iron. One common method required the accused to carry a piece of heated iron for a specified distance. The metal, glowing red from the fire, tested both endurance and divine favor. After completing the task, the wounds were bandaged and the accused hands were examined after a few days. Minimal infection or healing was interpreted as proof of innocence, while severe burns indicated guilt. Boiling water or oil in some regions. The accused would plunge their hands or arms into boiling water or oil. This ordeal tested physical tolerance, but more importantly, it was believed that God would shield the innocent from severe harm. Clerics often blessed the liquid, invoked prayers, and maintained the ritual's spiritual integrity. Walking on coals, perhaps the most iconic form of trial by fire, was walking barefoot across a bed of hot coals. The ritual required preparation, prayer, and a carefully prepared path to ensure fairness. Observers watched closely, interpreting each step and wound as evidence of innocence or guilt. The flames represented the divine gaze, and every step was an appeal to higher judgment. The ritual trials by fire were highly ceremonial. The accused was often dressed in simple clothing, sometimes stripped of metal objects that might interfere with the test. Clerics conducted prayers, invoking saints and angels to witness the ordeal. Candles and torches illuminated the path. While the community gathered to observe, spectators served multiple purposes. They provided validation, witnessed fairness, and reinforced communal belief in the divine authority of the ordeal. The trial was public not only to ensure honesty, but also to educate, reminding everyone that God's judgment was impartial, omnipresent, and inescapable. Social context and implications. The trial by fire was not equally accessible to all social classes. Nobles, clergy, and wealthy merchants often had advocates and protective measures in place. Peasants, on the other hand, faced the full force of the ordeal without such privileges. Nevertheless, even the most powerful relied on these trials to assert divine validation of their claims or innocence. Accusations could range from theft and assault to heresy and witchcraft. In disputes where evidence was lacking, fire offered an immediate, physical resolution. The belief that God would intervene reinforced both faith and obedience, creating a deeply entwined system of spiritual and social control. Clerical involvement. Clergy played an essential role in trials by fire, providing both legitimacy and spiritual oversight. They blessed the implements of judgment, recited prayers for protection, and interpreted outcomes. Their presence reassured the community that the ordeal was fair, sacred, and in alignment with divine will. The ritual's religious dimension was inseparable from its legal function. While the physical pain of fire was terrifying, it was also a test of piety, faith, and moral standing. Those who passed were seen not only as innocent, but as divinely favored, their survival a testament to both courage and righteousness. Historical examples documented trials by fire abound in medieval Europe. Records from England, France, and Germany describe disputes over property, accusations of theft, and charges of witchcraft resolved by flame. In one notable case, a peasant accused of theft had to carry a red-hot iron across the village square. He emerged with minor burns, which were interpreted as divine confirmation of his innocence. Stories like these circulated widely, reinforcing faith in the ordeal and warning others against transgression. In contrast, some trials ended tragically. A woman accused of witchcraft in 14th-century Germany walked barefoot across burning coals and suffered severe injury. The verdict of guilt reinforced the authority of the church and secular authorities, demonstrating the peril of defying law or morality. Symbolism of fire in these trials was never accidental or purely physical. It symbolized purification, divine scrutiny, and the destructive consequences of sin. The flames represented God's omniscient gaze, punishing deceit and rewarding truth. Each step across hot embers, each plunge into scalding water, was a negotiation between human endurance and divine will. The symbolism extended to social cohesion. By participating in or witnessing the ordeal, communities internalized moral and legal codes, understanding that transgression had both earthly and spiritual consequences. Fire became a universal language of justice and morality. Decline and legacy. By the late medieval period, trials by fire gradually waned. Legal systems developed more sophisticated evidence-based procedures, and torture or ordeals became less favored. Rationalist thought, emerging science, and centralized judicial authority rendered fire trials increasingly obsolete. Yet the cultural and symbolic legacy endured. Tales of fire ordeals influenced literature, folklore, and ceremonial practices. The dramatic imagery of innocence tested by flame continues to resonate, reminding us of a time when divine judgment was literally, and sometimes painfully, manifest in the world. Closing reflection. Picture the heat rising from smoldering coals, the faint scent of charred wood, the trembling hand of the accused, and the silent prayers whispered before the trial begins. Every crackle of flame is a reminder of life's fragility. Every scar a testament to the delicate balance between courage, faith, and divine justice. Trial by fire was more than an ordeal. It was an expression of a society where the divine and the human were inseparable. It exemplified a worldview in which law, morality, and faith converged, producing a justice system both awe-inspiring and terrifying. As you drift through the history of fire trials, imagine the flames licking the earth, the community watching in hushed reverence, and the moment when judgment is revealed not by human hands alone, but by the eternal witness of heaven. Chapter 7. Trial by Water. The immersive judgment in the quiet depths of medieval towns, beside rivers, wells, or village ponds. Another form of divine justice took shape, the trial by water, where fire tested courage and endurance. Water tested purity, innocence, and moral standing. This trial was a ritual steeped in symbolism, where the natural world and spiritual authority converged, and where the outcome was believed to be determined by God Himself. The trial by water was both feared and respected. Accused individuals would be immersed, bound, or even thrown into water to reveal their guilt or innocence. The method varied depending on the region, the crime, and the customs of the community. Yet the underlying principle remained constant. Water, as a sacred and purifying element, would reject the guilty and embrace the pure. Origins and philosophy. Water has always carried profound symbolic meaning in human culture. It cleanses, sustains, and transforms. In medieval Europe, these symbolic properties were adapted to judicial contexts. The notion of divine intervention through water was both practical and spiritual. Communities, often lacking sophisticated investigative methods, placed trust in a supernatural arbiter that could transcend human error. The trial reflected the medieval worldview, where the material and spiritual were intertwined. Crime was not only an offense against society, but also against divine order. Water became a medium through which moral truth was revealed, a mirror reflecting the soul as well as the body. Methods and variations. The ordeal of drowning, one of the most infamous forms of the water trial, involved binding the accused and submerging them in a river, pond, or deep well. Sometimes the hands and feet were bound, and ropes were used to lower the individual into the water. The theory was that the innocent would float, buoyed by divine favor, while the guilty would sink, punished by both God and gravity. The touch and immersion test. In less severe cases, the accused might be required to submerge their hands, arms, or even entire body while performing a ritual or reciting prayers. Clerics or officials observe the behavior of the water and the reaction of the individual, interpreting the results as signs of innocence or guilt. This method was often used for accusations of theft, adultery, or minor heresy, where the stakes were high but the risk of death needed to be mitigated. Cold water trials in colder regions. The trial involved immersion in freezing waters, testing not only innocence but resilience and fortitude. Hypothermia and physical exhaustion became part of the ordeal, emphasizing the harsh realities of medieval justice. In these trials, the boundary between divine judgment and physical endurance was blurred, making survival a testament to both spiritual favor and human will. Ritual and ceremony like the trial by fire. Water trials were steeped in ritual. The accused were often dressed in simple clothing, sometimes stripped of valuables or protective items. Clerics conducted prayers, invoking saints, angels, or holy water to sanctify the proceedings. Bells, chants, and ceremonial gestures heightened the sense of divine presence, creating an atmosphere where the mundane act of immersion became a sacred judgment. Communities gathered to witness the trial, reinforcing social cohesion and moral teaching. Spectators observed closely, interpreting every movement, ripple, or gasp as a sign from God. The communal aspect ensured that the trial's outcome was not only personal but also educational, reinforcing the omnipresence of divine law. Crimes tried by water trials were often applied to accusations of theft, adultery, witchcraft, and heresy. The belief was that God's will would manifest through the element of water, distinguishing innocence from guilt. For accusations of witchcraft, water served as a literal and symbolic test of purity. A witch was thought to be rejected by water, which would refuse to accept her. In some regions, accused witches were tied and thrown into a pond. Floating was interpreted as proof of guilt, while sinking indicated innocence, a paradoxical and terrifying logic that reflected deep societal fears. Adultery and moral transgressions also faced water trials, often in a less lethal form. Immersions, ritual washings, and symbolic dunkings were intended to cleanse, shame, and instruct, combining punishment with public spectacle. These trials served as moral lessons, teaching the community that divine justice was intertwined with everyday conduct. Clerical and judicial oversight clergy played a central role in water trials, ensuring that the ritual maintained spiritual legitimacy. They blessed the water, recited prayers, and interpreted outcomes according to church doctrine. The ritual emphasized that divine judgment was not arbitrary, but guided by sacred principles. Secular authorities often collaborated with clergy, providing the logistical framework, enforcement, and security needed to conduct the trial safely. Nobles and local officials recognized that water trials were not just spiritual exercises, they were instruments of social control, maintaining order and demonstrating the consequences of transgression. Symbolism of water, like fire, carried symbolic resonance. It represented purification, cleansing, and the boundary between life and death. In the trial context, it became a medium through which moral and divine truths were revealed. Immersion signified submission to higher authority, and survival signaled moral favor. The act of immersion itself was transformative, a liminal experience that bridged human frailty and divine oversight, risks and realities. While the concept of divine judgment imbued the trial with sanctity, the physical risks were significant. Drowning, hypothermia, and injury were common. Clerics and officials often attempted to mitigate these risks through ropes, shallow pools, or timing, yet the danger remained. This duality, the trial as both spiritual ordeal and physical hazard, highlighted the precariousness of life in medieval Europe and the omnipresence of risk in all forms of justice. Despite the peril, the trial was rarely viewed as cruel. Communities believed in the inherent fairness of divine judgment, accepting that suffering or survival carried moral significance. The trial reinforced faith, obedience, and communal values, creating a moral architecture as tangible as any written law. Historical examples documented water trials appear across medieval Europe. In England, Scotland, and Germany, legal records recount cases of theft, adultery, and heresy resolved through immersion or dunking. One notable case involved a woman accused of stealing a silver chalice from a local monastery. Bound and lowered into a cold pond, she struggled against the ropes, gasping for breath. Clerics and villagers watched as the trial unfolded, interpreting her survival as proof of divine favor and her innocence restored. In contrast, records from France tell of a man accused of heresy who drowned in a river, his body interpreted as evidence of guilt. These stories, while grim, reinforced societal values and maintained faith in the intertwined authority of church and community. Decline and legacy. The trial by water, like the trial by fire, gradually fell out of use as European legal systems evolved. Rational investigation, evidence-based procedures, and centralized judicial structures replaced trials based on divine intervention. Yet the cultural and symbolic legacy persisted. Tales of water trials influenced folklore, literature, and ceremonial practices. The image of innocence or guilt revealed through immersion continues to captivate. A reminder of a time when natural elements were trusted to unveil the truth. Reflection. Imagine the chill of water enveloping the accused, the trembling anticipation of the crowd, the subtle prayers whispered by clerics, and the silent observation of a society bound together by faith and law. Every ripple, every gasp, every movement carries significance. As divine and human judgment converge, the trial by water was more than a method of punishment. It was a ritual of morality, an assertion of divine authority, and a reflection of medieval Europe's complex relationship with justice. Through immersion, communities witnessed the tangible interplay between faith, law, and human endurance, a delicate and immersive dance that shaped life and morality in profound ways. As you drift into the history of water trials, let your mind visualize calm rivers, shadowed ponds, and sacred ceremonies, each one a story of courage, fear, and divine oversight. The water trials remind us that in the Middle Ages, every act of judgment was both a test of human resolve and a reflection of spiritual truth. Chapter 8: Trial by Combat. The Duel of Justice. Amid the shadowed forests, bustling castles, and cobblestone streets of medieval Europe, a different form of justice emerged, one that combined skill, courage, and divine oversight. The trial by combat. In an age when proof was often scarce and truth contested, combat served as a tangible method to determine guilt or innocence. It was not merely a battle of strength, but a ritualized expression of law, morality, and honor, believed to reveal the judgment of God through the outcome of the duel. Unlike trials by fire or water, which relied on symbolic endurance, the trial by combat pitted one individual directly against another. Accused and accuser, champion and defendant, stood in the open, weapons in hand, under the watchful eyes of judges, clerics, and the gathered community. The duel was a public spectacle, a convergence of law, religion, and social ritual, where personal skill and divine favor intertwined to reveal truth. Origins and philosophy. The concept of resolving disputes through combat can be traced to early Germanic and Frankish traditions. These societies believed that God would intervene to ensure that the righteous party prevailed. A victory in battle was therefore interpreted as divine endorsement, while defeat signaled guilt or wrongdoing. This method emerged in regions where legal evidence was scarce, literacy limited, and centralized authority not yet firmly established. Trial by combat was considered both fair and sacred. In a world where written records were few and personal testimony could be unreliable, combat became a physical manifestation of justice. The duel represented a tangible test, where divine will, individual courage, and martial skill merged. It was a system rooted in faith, where heaven's judgment was visible through the strength, endurance, and skill of human hands. The duel of accusation. The process began with the formal accusation. One party, the plaintiff, brought a complaint against another, the defendant. Accusations could range from theft, assault, and property disputes to more severe charges, such as treason or murder. The courts, often composed of a mix of secular authorities and clergy, arranged a duel as a final arbiter when evidence was inconclusive or contested. Challengers and defenders prepared with solemnity. Knights donned armor polished to reflect both practicality and ceremonial grandeur. Weapons were inspected, and rules of engagement carefully articulated. Rituals included blessings by clerics, oaths of honor, and sometimes the presence of a sacred relic to sanctify the combat. Every element reinforced the sacred nature of the duel, emphasizing that this was not mere violence but a divinely sanctioned trial. Rules and regulations. Trials by combat were highly codified, especially by the late Middle Ages. Duels could take place on neutral ground, often a raised platform or designated field, ensuring that the battle was witnessed by both participants, their allies, and the broader community. Officials ensured fairness, preventing cheating, excessive interference, or unlawful conduct. Combatants could fight unarmed, with blunt weapons, or in full armor depending on the offense and local customs. For serious accusations like murder, the duel could be fought to the death. Lesser disputes might involve limited blows or the symbolic drawing of blood. Clerics and judges presided to ensure that rules were followed and that the combat retained its sacred significance. The duel was not only a test of physical prowess, but also a trial of faith. Participants were expected to invoke divine protection, maintaining the belief that God would guide their hands and safeguard the innocent. Victory was a public validation, a moment where justice was made visible, undeniable, and immediate. Spectacle and social dynamics. Trials by combat were dramatic public events. Villagers, townsfolk, and nobility gathered to witness the duel, their anticipation a mixture of fear, excitement, and reverence. The outcome held immediate social consequences. The guilty were punished, the innocent restored, and both the victor and the surrounding community reinforced in their understanding of divine justice. Spectators played a critical role in the ritual, their attention amplifying the moral weight of the combat. Cheers, prayers, and gasps punctuated the duel, transforming it into a communal affirmation of justice. The duel became a living narrative where every swing, parry, and fall communicated moral truth as much as physical skill. Champions and proxies. In some cases, the accused could appoint a champion to fight on their behalf. This was common when social status, age, or gender made personal combat impractical. The champion was bound by oath and honor, their success reflecting not only martial ability but the moral standing of the person they represented. Champions were often skilled warriors or knights, trained in the arts of combat. Their presence reinforced the seriousness of the trial, ensuring that even the most vulnerable had a means to defend their innocence. This proxy system highlighted the interplay between individual responsibility, societal roles, and divine judgment. Types of trials by combat varied according to the nature of the accusation. Feudal disputes, property, inheritance, and land disputes often resolved through duel, especially when competing claims could not be reconciled through evidence alone. Criminal charges, severe accusations such as murder or treason sometimes led to life or death combat, reflecting the gravity of the offense and the need for unequivocal judgment. Honor and chivalry, insults, slander, or breaches of knightly conduct could lead to ritualized duels to restore honor and social standing. Each duel was a microcosm of societal values, where courage, skill, and divine favor determined not only the outcome but the moral narrative of the community. The role of clergy-clerics played a central role in ensuring the duel's legitimacy. Priests blessed weapons, recited prayers, and observed the combat, interpreting victory and defeat as manifestations of divine will. Their presence underscored the sacred dimension of the trial, transforming physical combat into moral judgment that in some regions. The church regulated the frequency, participants, and procedures of duels, emphasizing that such trials were not acts of personal vengeance, but instruments of justice. The intertwining of secular authority and religious oversight created a system where law, faith, and martial skill were inseparable. Famous cases. Historical records recount numerous trials by combat. One famous case involved a land dispute between two knights in 12th century France. Both men were bound by oath, their families watching tensely as the duel commenced. After hours of grueling combat, the victorious knight claimed the disputed estate, and the community accepted the judgment as final, divinely endorsed, and morally binding. In England, records from the 13th century describe a trial by combat for a charge of theft and assault. The accused knight fought valiantly, invoking God's guidance, and ultimately triumphed, restoring his honor and demonstrating innocence in the eyes of the law and the divine. These stories, while often violent, reinforced societal norms, created moral exemplars, and offered a tangible connection between justice and divine oversight. Symbolism and psychological impact. The trial by combat was deeply symbolic. Armor represented not only physical protection but moral armor, a barrier between sin and survival. Weapons were both tools and extensions of divine judgment. The battlefield was a stage where faith, courage, and morality were enacted for all to witness. Psychologically, the duel reinforced communal values and individual behavior. The threat of combat, the honor of victory, and the shame of defeat shaped behavior, deterred crime, and elevated societal norms. Individuals internalized these lessons, understanding that divine and human judgment were intertwined, immediate, and visible. Decline of the practice. As legal systems evolved, the trial by combat gradually declined. Courts began to rely more on written evidence, witness testimony, and legal reasoning. Centralized authority reduced the need for violent adjudication. However, the practice persisted in some regions for centuries, leaving a lasting imprint on the cultural memory of justice, honor, and divine oversight. Literature, folklore, and art preserve the memory of these duels. Tales of knights fighting for truth, innocent parties vindicated through courage, and the dramatic spectacle of divine intervention continued to captivate imaginations long after the practice itself had ended. Reflection. Imagine the clang of steel, the strain of muscles beneath polished armor, the silent prayers whispered amid the roar of spectators. Each duel was a story of courage, morality, and faith, enacted in a world where evidence was scarce and divine guidance was paramount. The trial by combat reminds us that in the Middle Ages, justice was not abstract or distant. It was visible, immediate, and intertwined with the very fabric of life. The outcome depended on skill, endurance, faith, and perhaps the subtle hand of providence. As you drift through the history of medieval trials, envision the tension of the arena, the focus of the combatants, and the eyes of the crowd. Every swing of a sword, every parry, and every moment of courage carried moral significance, teaching lessons that echoed far beyond the battlefield. The duel was not just punishment. It was revelation, education, and a ritual of social cohesion. It allowed communities to witness justice made manifest, where innocence and guilt were revealed through the disciplined, ritualized, and symbolic act of combat. Chapter 9. Trials of Faith and Torture, the Crucible of Belief. In medieval Europe, faith was not merely a personal matter. It was a societal cornerstone, a lens through which law, morality, and order were interpreted. When disputes or accusations arose, The intertwining of religion and justice became most visible in trials designed to test belief. Trials by ordeal, trial by fire, trial by water, and forms of ritualized torture. These were methods both practical and symbolic, merging physical endurance with the spiritual notion of divine judgment. The medieval mindset held that God, ever watchful, would intervene in the affairs of humans. When earthly evidence was ambiguous, divine forces were invoked to reveal the truth. Trials of faith were predicated on the idea that the righteous would be protected, the innocent shielded from harm, and the guilty revealed through their suffering. What modern observers might see as cruel or arbitrary was, in the eyes of contemporaries, a sacred intersection of law, morality, and divine justice. The philosophy of ordeals, as a legal mechanism, had deep roots in early Germanic, Anglo-Saxon, and Norman traditions. The belief was simple yet profound. If a person underwent a dangerous or painful test and emerged unscathed, it was a sign of God's favor. Conversely, failure indicated guilt or sin. These trials were most often used in situations where accusations could not be settled by witnesses or material evidence. Common forms of ordeal included carrying hot iron, walking over red-hot plowshares, or retrieving objects from boiling water. Clerics performed blessings over the accused, invoking divine protection, while spectators observed the proceedings. Each ordeal was heavily ritualized, ensuring that the test was seen not as a mere human judgment, but as a reflection of God's will. Trial by fire. One of the most striking ordeals was trial by fire. The accused would hold a hot iron or walk over flames, with the severity and duration often varying by region and custom. Afterward, the wound was examined by a cleric. If it showed signs of healing, it was interpreted as proof of innocence. If it festered, guilt was presumed. The trial by fire was both terrifying and deeply symbolic. Fire, as an element, had long been associated with purification, judgment, and divine presence. By exposing a human body to fire, the medieval system sought to combine physical test with spiritual cleansing, revealing truth through endurance and faith. Trial by water. In contrast, trial by water relied on the symbolic purity of liquid. The accused was submerged in cold or boiling water, sometimes bound, sometimes free-floating. It was believed that pure water would reject the guilty and accept the innocent. In some practices, floating indicated guilt, while sinking was a sign of innocence. The ordeal by water held psychological and societal significance. It was a public spectacle that demanded faith, courage, and composure. Observers interpreted the behavior of the accused, reading gestures, screams, and reactions as reflections of moral and spiritual standing. These trials transformed an ordinary courtroom into a crucible of belief, where divine oversight and human experience converged. Torture as proof alongside ritualized ordeals. Medieval authorities employed torture to extract confessions and enforce compliance. Instruments such as the rack, thumbscrews, the iron chair, and the breaking wheel were designed to inflict both physical and psychological pressure. Unlike modern views of torture as purely punitive, medieval use often had an investigative purpose: confession, restitution, or moral correction. Torture was legally sanctioned in many regions, particularly in cases of heresy, witchcraft, and treason. Clerics and judges believed that truth could be revealed through endurance, that God would protect the innocent from yielding false confessions, and that the guilty would ultimately succumb to justice. While the methods were severe, they were framed within a moral and legal context, reflecting the era's belief that divine order must be preserved. Trials for heresy. The Inquisition, emerging in the 12th century and becoming more formalized by the 13th, epitomized the intertwining of faith and punitive justice. Individuals accused of heresy faced detailed investigations, interrogations, and sometimes public torture. Heresy was perceived as a direct challenge to both spiritual and temporal authority. Accusations could arise from suspicion, rumor, or political motives, yet the trial's procedures were meticulous. The accused were often held for extended periods, questioned repeatedly, and pressured to confess. Confession was a key goal, as it served both to restore the individual to the church and to reinforce communal moral order. Torture, when applied, was seen as a tool for spiritual as well as temporal truth, a grim pathway to divine judgment. Witchcraft and the supernatural fear of witchcraft permeated medieval life. Those accused of consorting with the devil, casting spells, or cursing neighbors faced trials that combined superstition, law, and ritualized punishment. Witch trials often employed ordeals similar to those used for heresy, with added elements designed to expose supernatural wrongdoing. Women, particularly the socially marginalized, were disproportionately accused. The trials reinforced both religious doctrine and social hierarchies, serving as a stark reminder that deviation from accepted norms could provoke deadly scrutiny. The ordeal transformed fear into spectacle, making communities acutely aware of moral expectations and divine oversight. Psychological and social dimensions. Trials by faith and torture were as much about shaping society as punishing individuals. They reinforced communal norms, established hierarchy, and created cautionary tales. Witnessing an ordeal instilled both awe and fear, reminding observers of the omnipresence of law, morality, and God's judgment. For the accused, these trials were psychologically harrowing. Facing fire, water, or pain demanded courage, resilience, and faith. Survival was not guaranteed, yet the belief in divine protection offered hope. The act of enduring an ordeal became a performative declaration of innocence, moral fortitude, and alignment with God's will. The role of clergy-clerics were central to the legitimacy of these trials. They blessed participants, supervised procedures, and interpreted outcomes. Their presence imbued the proceedings with sacred authority, ensuring that the ordeal was not merely physical punishment, but a reflection of divine justice. The clergy also mediated social repercussions. A successful ordeal could restore honor, reconcile disputes, and reaffirm communal order. Conversely, failure reinforced social hierarchies, moral lessons, and the authority of religious and secular powers alike. Decline of the ordeal as legal systems matured in the late Middle Ages. Trials by ordeal gradually declined. Evidence-based courts, written documentation, and procedural law reduced reliance on physical tests of faith. Yet the psychological and cultural imprint of these trials endured, influencing perceptions of justice, morality, and divine authority for centuries, despite their decline. Stories of ordeals persisted in literature, folklore, and art. Accounts of individuals walking through fire, plunging into sacred waters, or enduring torture became emblematic of faith, courage, and divine judgment. These narratives bridged history and myth, offering insight into the medieval worldview and its complex approach to crime, punishment, and belief. That reflection picture the flickering torchlight of a medieval hall, the whispered prayers of an accused heretic, the tense silence of a community watching the outcome. Trials of faith and torture were not only methods of legal adjudication, they were rituals that made abstract concepts of guilt, innocence, and morality tangible. Through fire, water, and pain, the medieval justice system sought to illuminate truth, enforce order, and cultivate obedience. These ordeals were more than punishment. They were dramatic, symbolic, and communal experiences that shaped behavior, belief, and social cohesion. As we continue this journey, let us imagine the courage required to face the unknown, the psychological weight of divine judgment, and the haunting beauty of a justice system where human frailty and spiritual conviction intersected in profound, and sometimes terrifying ways that eye in these trials. The Middle Ages reveal themselves as a world where faith was inseparable from law, where divine oversight dictated outcomes, and where every act of endurance, confession, or failure was a lesson etched into the collective memory of society. Chapter 10: Trial by Ordeal, Fire, Water, and the Divine Test that eye in Medieval Europe. When legal disputes became entangled with doubt and suspicion, the courts often turned to methods that combined both physical trial and spiritual judgment, the ordeal. Trials by ordeal were a reflection of a society where law, religion, and morality were inseparably intertwined. In the absence of modern investigative techniques, communities relied on divine intervention to reveal the truth. If human evidence failed, it was believed that God's hand would guide the outcome. The philosophy behind the ordeal was simple yet powerful. The innocent would be protected by divine providence, while the guilty would suffer the consequences. From the heat of the fire to the chill of sacred waters, each trial was a crucible of belief, where faith, courage, and the human body were tested. The accused often faced public scrutiny, and the outcome was not only a verdict on their guilt, but also a demonstration to the community of God's justice in action. Trial by fire. The trial by fire was one of the most dramatic and feared methods. The accused might be required to hold a red-hot iron, walk barefoot across burning coals, or retrieve a metal object from flames. After the ordeal, a cleric would inspect the wounds. If they healed cleanly, innocence was proclaimed. If infection set in or burns worsened, guilt was assumed. This practice combined physical endurance with spiritual symbolism, transforming a legal process into a ritual of purification and divine judgment. Fire symbolized both destruction and cleansing. It burned away sin in the eyes of the medieval populace, marking the ordeal as more than a punishment. It was a sacred test of alignment with divine will. Spectators, including local leaders, merchants, and peasants, watched closely, learning lessons about morality, obedience, and the consequences of wrongdoing. The trial by fire was not just an individual experience, but a communal lesson in justice. Trial by water. In contrast, the trial by water relied on the element's perceived purity. The accused might be bound and submerged in cold or boiling water, with the belief that water would reject the guilty and accept the innocent. Different regions interpreted outcomes differently. Floating could indicate guilt, sinking innocence, or vice versa. The ordeal demanded courage and faith, transforming the act into a visible interaction between human vulnerability and divine judgment. Water trials were particularly terrifying because they combined physical risk with spiritual stakes. Submersion tested survival instincts, while the possibility of supernatural interference loomed. Villagers observed intently, understanding that the outcome reflected God's approval or condemnation. Through this ritual, law and religion reinforced each other, creating a legal system that was as much about public morality as individual guilt. Trial by combat. Trial by combat was another form of ordeal, often reserved for disputes between noblemen or accusations requiring proof of strength and honor. In this trial, two parties would fight, with the winner considered vindicated. The belief was that God would grant victory to the righteous. Unlike fire or water, trial by combat tested skill, strategy, and courage, aligning with the medieval code of chivalry. Combat trials served multiple purposes. They resolved disputes, reinforced social hierarchies, and provided public spectacle. Knights, squires, and even common warriors participated, with outcomes influencing political alliances, inheritance, and reputation. The fight was as much a social performance as a test of guilt, with observers reading victory and defeat as reflections of divine will. The role of clerics played a central role in all ordeals. They blessed participants, ensured rituals were properly conducted, and interpreted outcomes. The clergy provided legitimacy, ensuring that trials were framed as divinely sanctioned rather than arbitrary punishment. Their presence added authority and moral weight, emphasizing that the law was not merely human but enforced by God's unseen hand. Clerics also mediated social and moral implications of the ordeal. They offered counsel, recorded results, and sometimes interceded in cases of extreme hardship. Their involvement reinforced the inseparability of faith and law, demonstrating that spiritual guidance was essential in interpreting human behavior and enforcing justice. Torture as a legal tool alongside physical ordeals. Medieval authorities often employed torture to extract confessions or verify guilt. Instruments such as the rack, thumbscrews, and the iron chair were designed to induce pain while observing responses. Torture was framed as a tool for truth rather than vengeance, reflecting the belief that God would protect the innocent and expose the guilty. These methods were particularly common in cases of heresy, treason, and accusations of witchcraft. Torture served both investigative and deterrent purposes. The public nature of these punishments demonstrated authority, instilled fear, and reinforced obedience. Witnesses understood that crime carried both spiritual and physical consequences, while the accused faced a relentless test of endurance, faith, and psychological resilience. Public spectacle and social function trials by ordeal were highly public events. Townspeople, officials, and clergy gathered to observe the outcome, interpreting it as a sign of divine will. The ordeal functioned as both justice and theater, creating narratives that shaped social norms and reinforced authority. Observers internalized lessons about obedience, morality, and the consequences of wrongdoing, ensuring that the trial's impact extended beyond the individual. The communal aspect was essential. The audience's reaction validated the verdict, while stories of successful or failed ordeals spread throughout the region. These narratives contributed to the medieval understanding of law and morality, embedding lessons in collective memory and reinforcing societal cohesion. Regional variations. The specific form of ordeal varied by region and circumstance. In England, trial by hot iron or water was common for theft and minor disputes. In France, trial by combat settled property or honor disputes among nobles. In Germany, ordeals might involve a combination of water and fire or physical tests of strength. Despite variations, all shared the same underlying principle. Divine intervention would reveal the truth. These differences reflected local customs, resources, and beliefs, demonstrating the adaptability of the ordeal system. The fundamental premise remained constant. The law was intertwined with faith, and physical tests served as proxies for moral and spiritual judgment. Decline and legacy. By the late Middle Ages, the use of trial by ordeal began to decline. Legal reforms, the rise of evidence-based courts, and centralization of authority reduced reliance on divine tests. The Church increasingly prohibited ordeals, emphasizing confession, penance, and formal judicial processes. Yet the cultural and psychological legacy endured. Stories of firewalks, water trials, and combat persisted in literature, art, and folklore, reflecting the medieval imagination's fascination with divine justice and human courage. Ordeals left an indelible mark on collective memory. They symbolized a society where faith and law were inseparable, where physical endurance was interpreted as divine judgment, and where public observation reinforced both moral and social order. Even as the legal landscape evolved, the ethos of the ordeal continued to shape perceptions of guilt, innocence, and justice. That reflection. Imagine a medieval village square, the air thick with anticipation, the accused kneeling before fire or water, clergy invoking divine oversight, and townspeople watching with bated breath. Each trial was a microcosm of medieval society, blending fear, faith, spectacle, and law. Outcomes were never merely personal. They were communal lessons in morality, courage, and divine justice. The trials remind us that medieval Europe was a world of intricate belief systems, where law, religion, and human experience intersected. They reveal the fragility of human authority and the profound influence of perceived divine judgment. To understand these ordeals is to glimpse the mindset of a society in which crime, punishment, and morality were inseparably entwined. Chapter 11. Torture Chambers, Tools of Pain and Confession that eye in the dim corridors of medieval castles, town halls, and dungeons, the echo of chains, the creak of wood, and the metallic glint of instruments told a story darker than any battlefield. Torture chambers were more than rooms of punishment. They were arenas of power, fear, and the human psyche. Here, law, faith, and authority converged to extract truth, punish transgression, and enforce obedience. The medieval world believed that physical suffering could uncover guilt, purify sin, and protect the social order, making the instruments of torture both tools of justice and symbols of societal control. The philosophy behind torture medieval. Authorities operated under the belief that the guilty could not escape divine or human scrutiny. Confession was the ultimate goal, seen not merely as admission of a crime, but as the restoration of order. Torture was rationalized as a path to truth. It was assumed that God would not permit the innocent to suffer unjustly. The psychological and physical torment inflicted in these chambers was thus framed as necessary, as a bridge between human doubt and divine judgment. The very architecture of a torture chamber reinforced its purpose. Dark, confined, and intimidating, these rooms were designed to isolate the accused, heightening anxiety and susceptibility. Shadows cast by flickering torches created a theater of fear. Every detail, from the placement of chains to the strategic use of sound, served to undermine the will of the prisoner, preparing them for confession. Pain was not the sole instrument. Fear, humiliation, and psychological pressure were equally potent. Instruments of agony, the arsenal of the medieval inquisitor or executioner, was varied and horrifying. The rack, a device designed to stretch the body, could dislocate shoulders, hips, and knees, leaving victims in agonizing positions. Thumbscrews compressed fingers and toes, often crushing bones slowly and methodically. The iron chair, lined with spikes, turned the simple act of sitting into unbearable suffering. These tools were not random. Each was carefully engineered to inflict maximum pain while maintaining the life of the accused, ensuring the possibility of confession and testimony. Other instruments targeted specific parts of the body to extract details or intimidate. The pair of anguish forced open mouths, orifices, or cavities, eliciting screams and compliance. The rack could be modified for ropes, chains, and pulleys, allowing controlled tension that extended suffering over hours. Devices like the breaking wheel turned the human body into a canvas of pain, a public statement that disobedience would meet ruthless consequences. Observers often witnessed these proceedings, reinforcing obedience through horror and spectacle. Torture and the law. Torture was a legally sanctioned method in many regions. Ecclesiastical courts employed it to uncover heresy, while secular authorities used it for crimes ranging from theft to treason. The legal framework was paradoxical. Torture was both extraordinary and procedural. It was employed only when evidence was inconclusive, yet its presence shaped entire trials. Judges, clerics, and executioners collaborated to balance coercion with a semblance of justice. The accused might be promised a reprieve if they confessed, blending fear, hope, and moral pressure into an inescapable trap. Torture was also a public warning. Accounts of confessions and executions spread through towns and villages, deterring crime and reinforcing social hierarchies. Stories of the rack, iron chair, or thumbscrews entered folklore, warning that law was omnipresent, ruthless, and intertwined with divine oversight. The fear of torture ensured compliance even before a crime was committed, making it as much a tool of social control as a mechanism for uncovering truth. Psychological dimensions: the human psyche was the silent battlefield in every torture chamber. Isolation, sensory deprivation, and anticipation heightened fear. Prisoners often confessed to crimes they did not commit simply to end their suffering. Interrogators exploited human vulnerability, using sleep deprivation, threats to family, or manipulation of religious belief. The combination of physical pain and psychological terror ensured that the accused were broken on multiple levels, making confession inevitable and obedience enforced. The psychological impact extended beyond the prisoner. Families, neighbors, and townspeople internalized the lessons of the torture chamber. Even without direct experience, the stories and rumors circulating in medieval communities reinforced moral codes and compliance. Torture thus operated both as an immediate judicial tool and as a long-term instrument of social engineering. Torture and confession. Confession was the ultimate aim of medieval torture. Legal authorities believed that physical suffering compelled the truth to surface. The act of confessing served multiple functions. It cleared doubt, allowed for sentencing or penance, and restored social equilibrium. In cases of heresy, confessions were particularly valuable. They demonstrated the power of faith, the authority of the Church, and the consequences of defiance. The ritual of confession under torture was as much symbolic as practical, reinforcing hierarchical, spiritual, and judicial authority simultaneously. In some instances, confessions were extracted from groups, creating an environment of fear and suspicion. Peers or associates might be implicated to save oneself, turning communities into networks of accusation and distrust. Torture thus extended its reach, influencing social dynamics far beyond the walls of the chamber. Torture and punishment: once a confession was obtained, the consequences ranged from execution to public penance. Punishments were meticulously designed to match the severity of the crime and the social status of the offender. Hanging, burning, beheading, or mutilation followed confession for serious crimes. Lesser offenses might result in flogging, branding, or imprisonment. Each act of punishment was both punitive and instructive, serving as a moral exemplar to the community. The combination of torture, confession, and subsequent punishment created a comprehensive system of control, blending fear, justice, and spectacle. Notable instruments and methods: the diversity of instruments reflected regional variations and ingenuity in cruelty. In France, the strappado suspended victims by their arms, dislocating shoulders while exposing them to further abuse. In Germany, the wheel shattered bones while public spectacle reinforced social norms. England employed the ducking stool for women accused of witchcraft or adultery, combining humiliation with physical discomfort. Each instrument carried its own symbolism, transforming pain into narrative and morality into tangible experience. The role of faith: the spiritual dimension of torture was inseparable from its physical reality. Clerics often oversaw proceedings, blessing instruments, praying over victims, or interpreting confessions. The medieval worldview held that sin, crime, and divine will were intertwined. The physical torment of the body mirrored the spiritual trial of the soul. Torture was thus both a legal and religious instrument, reinforcing obedience to both earthly and divine authority. Faith also provided justification for the community. Observers were not mere spectators of cruelty. They were witnesses to divine justice in action. Pain and confession validated moral order, demonstrating that transgression invited not only human punishment but cosmic consequences. Decline and legacy: by the late Middle Ages and early modern period, the prevalence of torture began to decline. Legal reforms, growing emphasis on evidence, and humanist critique challenged the use of coercion. Yet the cultural and psychological legacy endured. Tales of the rack, iron chair, and thumbscrews persisted in literature, art, and folklore. Torture chambers became symbols of fear, power, and the complexities of medieval justice. The echoes of these chambers remind us that medieval society viewed crime, punishment, and morality through a lens of intertwined physical, spiritual, and social consequences. Torture was not merely cruelty. It was a mechanism to enforce order, reinforce hierarchy, and shape collective belief. Its legacy illuminates the darker dimensions of human governance. Where justice and terror walked hand in hand, that reflection pictured the torchlit chamber, the condemned shivering in chains, the executioner preparing the rack, a cleric murmuring prayers, and townspeople listening to every sound from outside. Every detail, screams, shadows, cold stone, contributes to a tableau of fear, authority, and moral instruction. Torture chambers were more than sites of punishment. They were instruments of social, psychological, and spiritual control, shaping medieval society in profound and lasting ways. As we continue to explore medieval crimes, it becomes evident that torture was both an instrument and a symbol, a testament to human ingenuity, fear, and the relentless pursuit of control. Through the lens of these chambers, we witness the complexities of justice in a world where survival, morality, and authority were deeply intertwined. Chapter 12: Public Executions, Spectacle, Fear, and Morality that lie in the heart of medieval towns and cities. The public square was more than a marketplace or gathering place. It was a stage for justice, power, and moral instruction. Public executions were the apex of medieval law enforcement, transforming punishment into performance, fear into education, and crime into cautionary tale. Here, society confronted the consequences of transgression, witnessing firsthand the authority of the state, the church, and the social hierarchy. The purpose of public execution: medieval authorities understood that law alone was insufficient. Obedience needed to be reinforced through spectacle. Execution was both a consequence and a lesson, a vivid demonstration of what awaited those who defied societal rules. Townspeople, nobles, merchants, and peasants alike attended, understanding that the punishment of one served as a deterrent to many. The methods were gruesome, the procedures ritualized, and the psychological impact profound. A public execution was intended to instill fear, reinforce moral norms, and display the power of authority in ways that words or decrees could not. Beyond fear, executions had a symbolic dimension. They were a manifestation of divine justice, where the condemned's suffering was interpreted as penance for sin and a demonstration of societal order. Clerics often participated, preaching about the necessity of obedience and the consequences of evil. The execution, therefore, became both a secular and spiritual lesson, linking crime with moral and cosmic consequences. Common methods of execution: medieval society employed a range of execution methods, each chosen for its perceived justice, deterrent effect, and theatrical potential. Hanging was one of the most common punishments, particularly for thieves, murderers, and lower-class offenders. The condemned were hoisted into the air, sometimes left to swing until death claimed them. The sight of a body dangling in the public square served as a stark reminder of the reach of the law. Burning at the stake was reserved for crimes against the church or offenses considered particularly heinous, such as heresy, witchcraft, and sacrilege. Flames consumed the body, symbolizing purification and divine judgment. This method combined physical torment with profound moral messaging, leaving a lasting impression on witnesses. Beheading, often employed for nobles or high-status criminals, was considered more honorable, swift, and efficient. Yet even in these cases, the spectacle served a purpose. It reinforced social hierarchy while demonstrating that wealth or status could not entirely escape justice. The visual and psychological impact of these methods ensured that lessons were learned, fears were embedded, and moral order was reinforced. Other methods included breaking on the wheel, drowning, and drawing and quartering. Each technique carried layers of symbolism, dramatizing the consequences of rebellion, theft, or sacrilege. The selection of execution method was deliberate, balancing practicality, social message, and the status of the condemned. Public execution, therefore, was not merely punishment. It was a carefully orchestrated ritual of power, fear, and morality. Rituals and procedures. Public executions were highly ritualized events. The condemned were often paraded through the streets, bound and humiliated, to display authority and shame. Clerics read aloud accusations, providing moral and spiritual framing for the punishment. Town criers, heralds, and onlookers amplified the spectacle, ensuring that the execution resonated throughout the community. Preparations for the execution were meticulous. Gallows were inspected, pyres constructed, and executioners rehearsed their roles. Timing was crucial, often aligning with market days or festivals to ensure maximum visibility. The goal was not only to carry out justice, but to embed the consequences in the collective consciousness of the population. Public executions were lessons in obedience, order, and morality, dramatized to achieve maximum societal impact. Social and psychological impact. The presence of a public execution was a reminder that crime carried consequences beyond the individual. Families, neighbors, and bystanders internalized the lesson, often reinforcing social norms in daily life. Children witnessed fear, adults experienced moral reflection, and the guilty feared exposure and punishment. This collective experience served as a psychological enforcement of law and order, creating a culture where obedience was reinforced by both authority and social pressure. Public executions also provided a cathartic function for communities. Observing the punishment of transgressors allowed citizens to confront moral, social, and emotional anxieties. Fear, relief, and justice were intertwined, creating a shared narrative of morality, retribution, and divine order. The communal experience strengthened societal bonds while reminding everyone of the fragility of life and the permanence of law. Famous executions and their stories throughout the Middle Ages. Certain executions became legendary, cementing the role of public punishment in historical memory. Figures accused of heresy, treason, or heinous crimes were remembered not only for their actions, but for the spectacle of their demise. Chronicles and records detailed these events, capturing the horror, drama, and moral significance. Witches, heretics, and criminals alike were often remembered as warnings to future generations. Tales of burning, hanging, and mutilation circulated widely, becoming part of folklore and cultural memory. The stories reinforced authority, instilled fear, and ensured that lessons from one generation echoed into the next. Gender, class, and punishment. Execution practices were heavily influenced by social status and gender. Nobles might receive more honorable deaths, such as beheading, while commoners were subjected to hanging, burning, or more prolonged suffering. Women faced unique risks, particularly in cases involving accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or moral transgression. Methods like the ducking stool or burning were employed to enforce societal norms and maintain gendered hierarchies. Class and status shaped not only the method of execution, but also the public's perception and reaction, reinforcing societal divisions even in punishment. The role of executioners occupied a unique place in medieval society. Often ostracized yet essential, they were agents of the law, mediators between authority and the condemned. Their skill, discretion, and ritual knowledge ensured that executions were carried out effectively. Despite their role, Executioners were feared and socially isolated, their presence both necessary and taboo. The paradox of their position highlights the complex interplay of morality, power, and social order in medieval justice. Moral and religious dimensions. Public executions were imbued with moral and religious significance. Clerics often preached during executions, framing crime as a violation of divine and social order. Confession before death was encouraged, ensuring spiritual as well as temporal punishment. Executions thus served dual purposes, punishing earthly transgression and offering a pathway to redemption. This blend of fear and grace created a nuanced moral landscape, where death was both a warning and an opportunity for spiritual reconciliation. Decline of public executions over time. The frequency and spectacle of public executions began to wane. Legal reforms, humanist philosophies, and the rise of professional police forces transformed punishment into a more private affair. Nevertheless, the memory of these public spectacles endured, shaping cultural narratives, literature, and societal expectations about justice, morality, and authority. Reflection. Imagine a bustling medieval square, merchants selling goods, children playing, citizens pausing their routines, and in the center, a scaffold looming ominously. The condemned stands bound, clergy read prayers, and the crowd watches with a mix of fear, fascination, and moral reflection. Every detail, from the cries of the condemned to the chants of onlookers, creates a tableau of societal control, morality, and justice. Public executions were more than punishment. They were lessons, performances, and warnings, forever shaping the psyche of medieval Europe. As we continue this journey, the shadows of law, morality, and fear remain ever present. From torture chambers to public squares, the Middle Ages reveal a complex interplay of power, crime, and human experience, where every action was watched, judged, and remembered. The echoes of these executions serve as a reminder of a world where justice was visible, morality was performative, and fear was an instrument of social cohesion. Chapter 13. Witch Trials and Sorcery. The hunt for the supernatural. In the dimly lit villages, dense forests, and shadowed towns of medieval Europe, fear of the unseen was a constant presence. Crime was not only measured in material theft or bodily harm. It also encompassed the spiritual and supernatural. Accusations of witchcraft and sorcery were treated as some of the gravest offenses, combining legal, moral, and religious authority to confront threats both imagined and real. These trials were terrifying in scope, meticulous in procedure, and dramatic in consequence, leaving behind a legacy of horror, superstition, and injustice that would echo for centuries. Origins of witch hunts. Belief in witches and malevolent magic predates the Middle Ages, but the formalized witch hunts of medieval Europe emerged as society grew increasingly concerned with moral and social order. Villagers attributed unexplained deaths, crop failures, illness, and misfortune to witchcraft, creating a climate of fear and suspicion. The Church, while initially cautious, began to treat witchcraft as a crime against God and society, linking the supernatural to heresy. Manuals and treatises written by clergy codified beliefs about witches, demons, and sorcery, providing legal frameworks that guided trials and punishments. The combination of folklore, superstition, and religious authority created fertile ground for accusation. Women, particularly those on the margins of society, widows, healers, or the elderly, were often targeted. Their knowledge of herbs, healing, and ritual practices, once respected, became a source of suspicion. Even minor disagreements with neighbors or unexplained misfortune could trigger accusations, creating a social landscape where fear and personal vendettas intertwined. Legal frameworks and ecclesiastical authority. Witch trials were conducted under both secular and ecclesiastical courts. each bringing its authority and methods. The Church framed witchcraft as a spiritual crime, a rebellion against divine order. Accused individuals were summoned to ecclesiastical courts, interrogated, and often pressured to confess. The secular courts viewed witchcraft as a threat to social stability, particularly if it was believed to harm crops, livestock, or community members. Collaboration between these authorities ensured that accused witches faced legal, moral, and spiritual consequences simultaneously. The inquisitorial process became central to these trials. Accused individuals were questioned meticulously, and confessions were extracted through intimidation or torture. Clergy recorded every statement, ensuring that trials produced detailed accounts that could be referenced in future cases. Torture devices such as the rack, thumbscrews, and strappado were employed to extract truth, while the accused's own fear and social isolation amplified the psychological pressure. Confessions often implicated others, creating a chain reaction of accusations that spread fear throughout the community. The accusation process accusations of witchcraft often began with suspicion, rumor, or misfortune. A neighbor's crop might fail, livestock die, or a child fall ill, and someone had to be blamed. This social need to identify a culprit often intersected with pre-existing prejudices, gender norms, and personal vendettas. Women who lived alone, practiced herbalism, or exhibited non-conforming behavior were especially vulnerable. Communities sought explanations for misfortune, and witches became convenient scapegoats for circumstances that were often beyond human control. The process of accusation was formal and informal. Informal accusations could spread rapidly through gossip, creating a climate of fear. Formal accusations were submitted to local authorities or the church, prompting investigation. Once accused, individuals were summoned to court, interrogated, and subjected to various tests. The mere suspicion of witchcraft was often enough to trigger imprisonment and investigation, with the accused facing overwhelming odds. Torture and coerced confessions. Torture was central to the witch trials. Medieval authorities believed that witches were inherently deceptive, and confession was considered the ultimate proof of guilt. Devices like the rack, iron chair, and thumbscrews were employed to compel admission of guilt, often under excruciating pain. The accused might name accomplices or admit to pacts with demons, creating a web of fear and accusation that extended beyond the individual. These confessions, whether true or coerced, became legal documents that justified severe punishment. Torture not only inflicted physical suffering, but also manipulated psychological states, forcing the accused to internalize guilt and despair. The public nature of some trials amplified fear within the community, reinforcing social norms and obedience while deterring potential transgressors. Punishments for witchcraft. Punishments for convicted witches were as severe as the accusations themselves. Execution by burning was common, symbolizing purification and divine justice. Hanging, drowning, or mutilation were also employed, depending on local customs and the perceived severity of the crime. The spectacle of punishment reinforced authority and demonstrated the consequences of defying societal and divine law beyond death. Punishments often included confiscation of property, social ostracism, and public shaming. The goal was not only to punish the individual, but also to reassert communal norms and spiritual order. Families of the accused could suffer social and economic consequences, highlighting how witch trials extended punishment beyond the individual and into the wider community. Case studies and notorious trials. Some trials became infamous, capturing the imagination of later generations. Accusations might involve claims of flying through the night, summoning demons, or casting curses that brought death or disaster. Clerical and secular records preserve these cases in chilling detail, demonstrating both the fear and fascination surrounding witchcraft. Communities used these examples as cautionary tales, embedding the narrative of sin, fear, and justice deeply into cultural consciousness. The high-profile cases often involved elements of politics, personal vendetta, or social tension. Trials could be manipulated to remove rivals, seize property, or settle scores. The witch hunts thus served as both moral and social instruments, blending genuine fear with opportunistic exploitation. Gender, power, and vulnerability. Women were disproportionately accused of witchcraft, reflecting broader societal views of gender and power. Socially marginalized women were particularly vulnerable, but even well-off or educated women could be targeted under certain circumstances. The accusation of witchcraft was a tool of social control, regulating behavior and reinforcing male-dominated authority structures. Women's roles as healers, midwives, and independent actors became sources of suspicion, illustrating the intersection of fear, gender, and social hierarchy in medieval Europe. Men were also accused, particularly in cases involving necromancy, sorcery, or heretical practices. However, women remained the primary targets, highlighting societal anxieties surrounding female autonomy and power. Trials thus revealed deep insights into gender dynamics, social tensions, and the mechanisms of control in the medieval period. Cultural and psychological impact. The fear generated by witch trials extended far beyond individual victims. Entire communities internalized the threat of sorcery, altering behavior, suspicion, and social interaction. Festivals, sermons, and folklore reinforced these narratives, embedding the fear of the supernatural into everyday life. The psychological impact was profound, shaping moral norms, social cohesion, and compliance with both secular and ecclesiastical authority. The collective memory of these trials persisted long after individual executions, influencing literature, art, and social attitudes. The witch hunt became a symbol of the dangers of fear, superstition, and unchecked authority, leaving lessons for future generations about the power of belief and the consequences of moral panic. That reflection. Imagine a village square at dusk. Whispers of sorcery weaving through the air, torches flickering against stone walls. A trial begins, the accused trembling under the scrutiny of both clergy and community. Every question, every gesture, every public reading of the charge amplifies fear and anticipation. The community witnesses not just the fate of one person, but the reaffirmation of moral and spiritual order. Witch trials were theater, judgment, and societal instruction all at once, leaving indelible marks on the human psyche and the cultural memory of medieval Europe. The hunt for witches and sorcerers reveals the intersection of belief, law, and social control, illustrating how fear and morality shape daily life. As we continue, the shadow of superstition stretches across villages, towns, and courts, reminding us that in the Middle Ages, the supernatural was not simply imagined, it was feared, judged, and punished with rigor and intensity. Chapter 14: Blood Feuds and Vendettas. Family, honor, and retribution. In the tangled web of medieval Europe, honor and family loyalty often carried more weight than law itself. Crime was not always a matter of breaking codified statutes. It could be a matter of defending one's reputation, avenging insult, or asserting power. Blood feuds and vendettas dominated rural and urban landscapes alike, shaping communities through cycles of violence, intimidation, and revenge. These feuds were rooted in complex social structures where personal honor, family allegiance, and political influence intersected, creating an enduring legacy of both brutality and fascination. Origins of feuds. Blood feuds often emerged in regions where central authority was weak, leaving families and clans responsible for enforcing their own justice. An insult, theft, or murder could spark a chain reaction of retaliatory violence, with each act justifying the next. Social norms dictated that a family could not allow an offense to go unpunished without losing honor and status. In this context, vengeance was not only accepted, it was expected. Failing to respond could weaken a family's position, invite further aggression, and disrupt local balance. The rural environment amplified these dynamics. Villages were small, tightly knit, and dependent on mutual cooperation, yet isolation made them vulnerable to conflict. Disputes over land, resources, or marriage alliances often escalated into feuds, dragging entire communities into cycles of violence. Over generations, these vendettas became deeply ingrained, with rules, customs, and rituals guiding the pursuit of revenge. Honor and social hierarchy. Honor was a currency in medieval society, particularly among the nobility and landed classes. A family's reputation could determine marriages, alliances, and political influence. A public insult or slight could prompt violent retribution, with legal systems often powerless or unwilling to intervene. Vendettas were as much about perception as action. Failing to retaliate could signify weakness, while decisive action could enhance prestige and influence. Among peasants and townsfolk, honor also held significance, though expressed differently. Disputes might involve property, labor obligations, or social slights. While the stakes were lower than in noble circles, the consequences of failure to defend honor could still be severe, leading to cycles of petty violence that mirrored the feuds of the aristocracy. The mechanics of feuds followed patterns shaped by social expectations and practical realities. Families would gather allies, plan ambushes, and target both direct perpetrators and their supporters. Violence could range from intimidation and property damage to murder and arson. Communities often became complicit, either by providing shelter, warning of danger, or participating in attacks. The line between justice and revenge blurred, as each act of retaliation was framed as rightful redress rather than lawlessness. Medieval codes of conduct, such as chivalric codes among knights, provided a framework for feuds, dictating who could be attacked, how conflicts were to be initiated, and when reconciliation could occur. Ritualized duels, compensation payments, or mediated settlements sometimes ended feuds, but these resolutions were fragile, dependent on honor and trust. Breaches of agreement could reignite violence decades later. Case studies. Famous vendettas. Historical records are filled with examples of prolonged feuds that devastated families and regions. Noble houses frequently engaged in vendettas that involved not only combatants, but entire networks of allies. Towns could become battlegrounds, and markets, churches, and bridges were not immune to violence. Chroniclers often documented these feuds with fascination, detailing the escalation, strategies, and outcomes. Some feuds became legendary, inspiring literature, ballads, and cautionary tales about the destructive power of vengeance. Even smaller-scale feuds among commoners could be deadly. Disputes over grazing rights, water access, or theft might escalate into armed confrontations, with entire villages drawn into conflict. The social fabric was constantly under strain, balancing cooperation for survival with the instinct for revenge and protection of honor. Mediation and intervention. Although feuds were common, medieval societies also developed mechanisms for mediation. Lords, local officials, or clergy could intervene to negotiate settlements, often involving compensation, public apology, or ritualized reconciliation. The Church played a role in promoting forgiveness and penance, framing vengeance as sinful while offering alternative forms of justice. However, enforcement was inconsistent, and the success of mediation relied heavily on trust and social pressure. In some cases, kings or regional rulers intervened to curb feuds that threatened stability. Decrees could ban retaliation, impose fines, or execute key participants. While these measures sometimes ended cycles of violence, feuds were often deeply rooted, And local customs and family pride could undermine royal or ecclesiastical authority. Feuds and law. The tension between feuds and formal law reveals the complexities of medieval justice. Legal codes existed, but enforcement was uneven, particularly in rural areas. Families often bypassed courts entirely, relying on private retribution to defend honor. Legal remedies, such as fines or compensation payments, were sometimes accepted as alternatives to violence, but these required mutual agreement and recognition of authority. Feuds highlight a society where law and social custom coexisted, sometimes in harmony, often in conflict. In urban settings, guilds and municipal authorities sought to regulate violence and maintain order. They imposed fines, enforced oaths, and mediated disputes. Nevertheless, personal vendettas persisted, occasionally erupting into deadly confrontations that undermined civic authority. Psychological and cultural dimensions. Feuds had profound psychological effects on participants and communities. The constant threat of retaliation created an atmosphere of vigilance, mistrust, and tension. Families trained children in combat skills, survival, and strategy, preparing each generation for potential conflict. Fear and honor dictated behavior, influencing social interactions, marriages, and alliances. Culturally, feuds were embedded in narratives of heroism, loyalty, and justice. Literature, songs, and folklore celebrated both cunning and bravery, often blurring the line between criminality and valor. These stories reinforced social norms, demonstrating the rewards of loyalty and the dangers of disrespecting family honor. The enduring legacy. Blood feuds gradually declined as centralized authority strengthened. Courts became more effective, and communities shifted toward regulated justice. However, their legacy persists in cultural memory, literature, and historical consciousness. The mechanisms of honor, vengeance, and familial obligation continue to fascinate, offering insights into the moral and social framework of medieval Europe. Reflection. Picture a rural village at dusk, the horizon shadowed by forests where ambushes could await, and neighboring estates where grievances simmered. Families gather weapons, allies, and strategies, each action justified by honor, necessity, and survival. The cycle of violence seems endless, yet embedded in these conflicts is a complex moral and social system, where law, loyalty, and revenge intertwine. Blood feuds were not mere criminality. They were a reflection of medieval life itself, revealing the precarious balance between community, family, and individual survival. Chapter 15. Public torture and execution. Spectacle of pain and control. In the shadowed streets and squares of medieval towns, justice was not hidden behind closed doors. It was a public theater. The executioner's block, the scaffold, and the pillory were not merely tools of punishment. They were instruments of social control, morality lessons, and communal warning. Public torture and execution were deeply ingrained in the medieval consciousness, a spectacle designed to impress upon all who witnessed it the inescapable reach of law, authority, and divine judgment. The purpose of public punishment. Unlike modern penal systems that often confine punishment to prisons, medieval authorities understood the communicative power of visibility. The public display of punishment served multiple purposes: deterrence, retribution, reinforcement of social hierarchy, and moral instruction. Crowds gathered to witness the fate of the guilty, to internalize the consequences of disobedience, and to reaffirm collective norms. Execution was as much about shaping behavior as it was about penalizing wrongdoing. The psychological impact was immense. Seeing the body of a criminal mutilated, burned, or hanged instilled fear, respect, and compliance. These spectacles were communal experiences, where gossip, rumor, and the thrill of witnessing justice intertwined. Townsfolk, merchants, and peasants absorbed these lessons daily. internalizing the moral and social codes that underpinned medieval life. Torture as a tool of confession and control. Torture in the Middle Ages was not random cruelty. It was a sanctioned instrument of interrogation, confession, and coercion. Authorities believed that pain could compel truth and reveal hidden crime. Instruments of torture were varied and ingeniously cruel. Racks stretched bodies, thumbscrews compressed fingers, iron chairs burned flesh, and the breaking wheel shattered bones. Each device served both functional and symbolic purposes, demonstrating the capacity of the state and the church to enforce obedience. The process of torture was ritualized. Victims were often stripped, bound, and displayed before executioners or inquisitors. The careful orchestration reinforced authority, signaling that law and divine will were inextricable. Confessions extracted under duress were recorded and often used to justify further punishment, both of the individual and of perceived accomplices. Fear of torture was universal, shaping behavior and deterring criminal activity even before a formal trial. Execution methods and meaning. Execution methods were deliberate and symbolic. Hanging, beheading, burning, and breaking on the wheel were chosen based on the crime, social status of the offender, and moral message to be conveyed. A noble might receive a swift beheading, while a commoner could endure prolonged suffering to illustrate the consequences of defying authority. Heretics and witches were often burned at the stake, a punishment that conflated physical destruction with spiritual purification. Public executions were meticulously staged. Scaffolds were erected in prominent squares, crowds assembled from surrounding villages, and heralds proclaimed the crimes and sentences. Clergy often attended, offering prayers, absolution, or moral commentary. The interplay of ritual, ceremony, and terror created an environment in which punishment transcended the individual, teaching society as a whole the price of transgression. The role of the executioners were feared, ostracized, and yet essential. Their role extended beyond the mechanics of punishment. They embodied the authority of law and the inevitability of death. Executioners were often marginalized socially, carrying out duties that required both technical skill and psychological detachment. Despite their notoriety, they were indispensable agents of order, enforcing societal rules when persuasion, negotiation, and courts could not suffice. Executioners also served as instruments of spectacle. Their attire, tools, and behavior amplified the drama of punishment, turning each act into a moral and visual lesson. Stories of their cruelty, skill, and impartiality were told across villages, reinforcing both fear and respect. Public reactions and cultural significance. Spectators of medieval punishment responded with a complex mix of fear, fascination, and morality. The crowd's reactions were a reflection of societal norms, cultural expectations, and the collective understanding of justice. Observing a criminal's pain reinforced the social contract. Obedience, loyalty, and respect for authority were paramount. The communal experience created a shared moral language, where crime, punishment, and virtue were publicly negotiated and witnessed. In literature and folklore, tales of executions and torture were amplified. Chroniclers detailed gruesome events, ballads commemorated dramatic punishments, and moral treatises debated the ethics of various methods. These cultural artifacts ensured that the lessons of public punishment endured beyond the square, extending into memory, education, and legend. Torture and execution. In judicial context, torture and execution were rarely arbitrary. They were embedded within judicial processes. Trials often involved detailed investigation, witness testimony, and legal argumentation. Torture was employed to secure confessions, clarify disputes, or uncover accomplices. Execution followed legal determination, marking the culmination of a process that combined evidence, authority, and social expectation. However, the application was far from uniform. Social class, gender, and political connections influenced both the method and severity of punishment. Noble offenders might receive mitigated penalties, while commoners faced harsher, more public displays. The system reflected not only law but hierarchy, maintaining societal order while emphasizing the consequences of transgression. Symbolism and the message to society, the spectacle of pain, carried deep symbolic weight. Punishment was a visual metaphor. The body destroyed, the soul warned, the community educated. By witnessing executions, the public absorbed lessons about sin, obedience, loyalty, and fear. The medieval understanding of justice was inseparable from morality, religion, and social cohesion. Execution and torture were tools to communicate that law was not merely a codified system, but a manifestation of divine and temporal authority, psychological and social implications for communities. The presence of public punishment shaped behavior, relationships, and social norms. Fear of torture or execution regulated conduct, deterred crime, and reinforced hierarchies. Children learned the consequences of defiance. Citizens internalized moral codes, and potential offenders calculated risk. Yet these spectacles also fostered desensitization, fascination with cruelty, and a cultural acceptance of violence as part of life and order. That reflection, imagine a crowded medieval square at dawn. Torches flare, the scaffold looms, and the murmur of the crowd rises in anticipation. The condemned is brought forward, their fate a lesson for all. Executioners move with precision, priests offer absolution, and townsfolk absorb the spectacle with fear and fascination. Each act reinforces the omnipresence of authority, the intertwining of law and morality, and the delicate balance of power and obedience. The medieval world was harsh, vivid, and visible, a society that transformed punishment into both a necessity and an art of social instruction. Chapter 16. Witch Trials and the Scourge of Heresy. The medieval mind was intertwined with faith, superstition, and fear. In a world where the line between the natural and supernatural was blurred, accusations of heresy and witchcraft carried a weight that could end lives. For medieval communities, the fear of hidden evil was as real as the threat of famine, disease, or invading armies. The accused were not merely suspects of crime. They were perceived as agents of darkness, subverting divine and social order. Witch trials and heresy investigations became instruments of both spiritual control and societal regulation, reflecting anxieties about morality, authority, and the unseen world. The fear of the supernatural in medieval Europe. Misfortune was often attributed to forces beyond human understanding. Crops failed, livestock died, and disease spread, and the search for explanation was immediate. Witches and heretics became scapegoats for these disasters. Communities believed that malevolent magic, pacts with the devil, or heretical teachings could destabilize society. The fear was not only of individual wrongdoing but of collective peril, and it justified extreme measures to root out the perceived evil. Suspicion could arise from jealousy, personal vendettas, or unexplained occurrences, turning neighbors into accusers and fueling cycles of fear and accusation. Heresy, crime against God, and community heresy was considered one of the gravest offenses. To deny the Church's teachings or to preach alternative doctrines was to threaten the spiritual fabric of society. Those accused faced ecclesiastical courts, where inquisitors wielded immense authority. Trials were designed to extract confession and repentance, often through coercion or torture. Punishment was harsh: excommunication, imprisonment, or death. The act of heresy was both a spiritual and political challenge, as the Church depended on uniform belief to maintain control. Heretics were seen as not only endangering their souls but imperiling the community, requiring a decisive and often brutal response. The role of inquisitors were agents of both fear and order. Appointed by church authorities, they investigated alleged heresy with methodical precision. They questioned the accused, gathered testimonies, and often relied on informants. Torture was sanctioned in many cases, seen as a tool to reveal hidden sins and to bring wayward souls back to the path of God. The inquisitor's authority was absolute within the trial. The accused had little recourse. Confessions, whether voluntary or coerced, were meticulously recorded, often forming the foundation of enduring historical narratives of witchcraft and heresy. Witchcraft accusations: women were disproportionately accused of witchcraft, though men were not immune. Marginalized members of society, widows, the poor, healers, and those living outside conventional norms, were especially vulnerable. Accusations ranged from casting curses to consorting with the devil. Evidence was often circumstantial. A failed crop, a sudden illness, or simply gossip could trigger suspicion. The accused were frequently interrogated, their confessions sometimes extracted under torture. Punishments were severe, typically involving imprisonment, mutilation, or execution by burning, symbolically purging evil from the world. Trials and torture. Witch trials were highly ritualized. Accused individuals were brought before judges or inquisitors, witnesses were called, and confessions were extracted. Torture devices, such as the rack, thumbscrews, and iron chairs, were employed to compel truth or confession. These trials were public, serving as warnings to the community and reinforcing the omnipresence of church authority. The accused were often paraded, questioned repeatedly, and forced to admit complicity in supernatural crimes. Confessions, even under duress, were treated as moral and legal proof, reinforcing the narrative of pervasive evil. Punishments and public spectacle. Execution for heresy or witchcraft was often dramatic and highly symbolic. Burning at the stake was the most common method, intended to destroy both body and soul and to signal the eradication of evil. Other punishments included imprisonment, mutilation, or lifelong penance. These acts were public events, attended by townsfolk who absorbed both fear and moral instruction. Through spectacle, authorities communicated the consequences of deviating from religious or social norms, ensuring that obedience, faith, and conformity were reinforced within the community. Social and political dimensions. Witch trials and heresy investigations were not solely about morality. They were tools of social and political control. Accusations could be leveraged to remove rivals, seize property, or consolidate power. In some cases, local leaders or church authorities encouraged prosecutions to assert authority and unify populations against perceived threats. Fear of the supernatural became a mechanism to enforce hierarchy, obedience, and loyalty. By controlling belief and punishing deviation, authorities maintained both spiritual and temporal dominance over their communities. Cultural implications. The impact of witch trials and heresy investigations extended far beyond the courtroom. Tales of witches, heretics, and inquisitors became part of folklore, literature, and communal memory. These stories reinforced moral lessons, perpetuated fear, and informed cultural norms for generations. The combination of historical record and legend created a rich narrative tapestry, in which the trials of the medieval period resonated as cautionary tales, moral lessons, and dark curiosities. Psychological impact. The psychological effect on communities was profound. Fear of accusation, confession, and punishment governed behavior. Individuals adjusted conduct to avoid suspicion, reinforced social hierarchies, and internalized moral codes. Children learned through stories and observation. Adults navigated a world where rumor, belief, and authority converged. The omnipresence of potential spiritual or temporal punishment created a society in which obedience and conformity were not merely encouraged, they were necessary for survival. Reflection. Imagine a small medieval village at dusk. The church bell tolls, signaling the start of an inquisition. Neighbors whisper, fear and suspicion mingle in the cold air, and the accused are brought forward for questioning. The inquisitor's gaze is relentless, the instruments of torture waiting in shadowed corners. Confessions are coerced, penance is assigned, and in some cases, death is the final judgment. The community watches, internalizes, and carries the lesson forward. This was the reality of medieval Europe, where belief, fear, and authority intertwined in the relentless pursuit of moral and social order. The witch trials and persecution of heresy reveal a world in which crime, faith, and fear were inseparable. Through these trials, the medieval church exercised spiritual authority and social control, shaping morality, behavior, and law. These stories remind us of the human cost of fear, the dangers of unchecked authority, and the enduring power of belief in shaping societies. The shadows of medieval Europe were long, and in those shadows, the accused, the inquisitors, and the witnesses all played their parts in a drama that would echo through history. Chapter 17. Ordeal Trials and the Idea of Divine Judgment. In the hushed halls of medieval courts, beneath the flickering light of tallow candles and the cold echo of stone walls, there was one truth that every soul believed. Justice did not belong solely to men. It belonged to God. Kings could decree, priests could pronounce, nobles could argue their cases, but ultimately it was the Almighty who decided between guilt and innocence. This conviction gave birth to the most chilling and mysterious aspect of ordeal trials, the idea of divine judgment. For centuries, ordeals were not simply tests of the body, but of the soul. To undergo the plunge into icy water, the grasp of red-hot iron, or the clash of steel in combat was not merely to submit to human justice, but to expose oneself before the watchful eyes of heaven. It was believed that God would never allow the innocent to suffer unjustly. Fire would not burn the pure. Water would not drown the virtuous. Blades would falter against those who carried righteousness in their hearts. This was the great premise, and it held the power to bind entire kingdoms in obedience and fear. The idea was as much theological as it was judicial. Medieval thinkers and church authorities taught that the ordeal was a judicium Dei, the judgment of God. When human reason faltered, when witnesses contradicted one another, when evidence was scarce or corrupted, there remained only one path: let God decide. In these moments, the courtroom transformed into a sacred stage where law and liturgy fused. Trials were conducted not with mere clerks and guards, but with priests chanting prayers, relics laid upon the table, and solemn oaths sworn before crucifixes. The ordeal became a kind of liturgy of fear, a sacrament of punishment and proof. Imagine standing barefoot in the courtyard of a monastery, surrounded by villagers and nobles alike. As a glowing iron bar was drawn from the fire, the priest would sprinkle it with holy water, recite sacred invocations, and declare that God himself would shield the innocent hand from harm. As you stepped forward, trembling, your entire fate rested not on men, but on the unseen will of heaven. Every breath, every heartbeat, was consumed by the thought, if I am righteous, I will be spared. If I am guilty, my sins will betray me. In that terrible instant, the human mind became a battlefield of terror and hope. This conviction gave ordeal trials a profound psychological grip. For those who believed without doubt, the ordeal was not only proof of innocence, but a pathway to spiritual vindication. For the guilty, however, it was an encounter with the terrifying certainty that God saw all, even what they tried to conceal. To stand before the ordeal was to stand before divine judgment, stripped of excuses and disguises. Yet, behind this religious veneer, there lurked darker truths. Priests and magistrates often prepared the ordeal, and subtle manipulations could change outcomes. A fire left burning longer or shorter, an iron cooled slightly, or the binding of ropes adjusted before a water ordeal. All could influence whether one lived or died, burned or healed, sank or floated. Still, for the onlookers, the spectacle remained holy, a manifestation of God's mysterious will. The ordeal also revealed a central paradox in medieval thought. On one hand, God was merciful, forgiving, and compassionate. On the other, he was terrifying, wrathful, and absolute. The ordeal embodied both aspects. It was salvation for the innocent, damnation for the guilty. It was a divine drama where heaven's justice was made visible through human suffering. This duality gave the ordeal both its power and its horror. People feared it, but they trusted it. They dreaded its pain, but they clung to its verdict as unshakable truth. In this way, ordeal trials became woven into the very fabric of medieval faith. Sermons echoed with reminders that God sees all, that he intervenes when called upon, that no sin could be hidden when the fires were lit or the waters stirred. And when miraculous survivals occurred, when someone emerged unscathed from fire, or when a supposedly weak man triumphed in combat, these moments were celebrated as divine miracles, proof that God still ruled among men. They strengthened belief, fueling the cycle of ordeals further, but not all outcomes reinforced faith. Sometimes the innocent were burned, drowned, or slain. Families cried out in despair, questioning why God had abandoned them. Skeptics whispered of corruption, of human hands guiding what was claimed to be divine will. These cracks in the edifice of faith grew over centuries, and though slowly, they began to erode confidence in the ordeal. Yet, even in doubt, the idea of divine judgment clung stubbornly to the medieval mind. Better to believe that heaven had spoken than to face the unbearable thought that justice was only human, and therefore fragile, flawed, and uncertain. The ordeal, then, was not merely a legal practice. It was a mirror of medieval belief. It reflected a world where heaven and earth were inseparable, where law and liturgy were intertwined, where justice was not a matter of evidence or argument, but of faith and fate. To undergo an ordeal was to surrender oneself utterly, to step into the abyss of uncertainty with only divine providence as protection. Even as the centuries passed and rational law began to take shape, the shadow of divine judgment lingered. Superstitions held fast. Kings and peasants alike feared invisible retribution, convinced that God's justice might still strike from the shadows. And though ordeal trials faded, the concept of a higher judgment, of sins uncovered, of guilt revealed beyond mortal courts, never truly disappeared. But what if divine judgment was not the end of the story? What if the true legacy of ordeal trials was not their faith in heaven, but their manipulation on earth? What if those who claimed to serve God's justice were, in truth, serving something else entirely? For in the shadows of this sacred drama, there lurked a hidden struggle, one not between guilt and innocence, but between power and submission, faith and fear. And as ordeal trials waned in Europe, they gave rise to something just as dark, just as mysterious, but infinitely more human. The cultural legacy that shaped societies long after the fires died and the waters stilled. Chapter 18. The cultural legacy of ordeals. The fires may have burned out, the waters may have stilled, and the clashing of steel and trial by combat may have faded into the annals of history. Yet the cultural echo of ordeals reverberates even today. For the ordeal was never simply a legal tool. It was a story, a ritual, and a performance that left scars not only on bodies, but on the collective memory of entire civilizations. To understand the legacy of ordeals is to understand how human beings grapple with fear, faith, and the desperate longing for justice in a world that often offered none. The ordeal imprinted itself onto the imagination of medieval Europe with a weight so profound that even centuries after their decline, their memory lingered in folklore, literature, and even in the subconscious habits of entire communities. Villagers who had once gathered to watch a suspected witch sink or float in a pond would tell stories of those events to their grandchildren, embellishing details, turning raw terror into myth. The man who held red-hot iron and emerged miraculously unscathed became not only a symbol of innocence, but a figure almost saint-like, whispered about as one touched by divine protection. In this way, ordeal trials did not die when they were outlawed. They transformed into legends, into tales that shaped cultural identity. One of the deepest legacies of ordeal was the persistence of the idea that justice must be visible, almost theatrical. In medieval times, justice was not something done quietly in private chambers. It had to be displayed before the community. The ordeal satisfied this need. It was a spectacle that invited the entire village to bear witness. And while the legal structure evolved, this appetite for public proof of guilt or innocence never vanished. Even in modern courtrooms, with juries and judges, there remains a hunger for visible drama, the confessions, the cross-examinations, the moment when truth is revealed. These rituals, though sanitized and stripped of fire and blood, carry the cultural DNA of the ordeal. The ordeal also carved its legacy into the intersection of religion and law. The medieval mind was shaped by the belief that God actively intervened in human affairs, and the ordeal dramatized this belief more vividly than any sermon could. Long after ordeals were banned, the notion that divine justice could manifest in earthly events persisted. People continued to interpret calamities, diseases, or strokes of fortune as signs of God's judgment. The ordeal had taught them that heaven spoke through suffering, and this lesson lingered, deeply woven into cultural thought. Even today, phrases like karma, divine, retribution, or fate catching up are echoes of that old conviction that higher powers will intervene when human justice fails. Yet perhaps the most insidious legacy of ordeals lies in how they reinforced structures of power. To control the ordeal was to control the narrative of justice. Priests who prepared the fire, nobles who presided over trials by combat, and kings who sanctioned the rituals, all of them wielded immense authority not only over the guilty, but over the terrified onlookers. The ordeal was theater, yes, but it was also propaganda, a performance stage to convince the masses that the powerful ruled with divine sanction. This model of authority, cloaked in ritual, spectacle, and fear, would outlive the ordeal itself, resurfacing in countless other forms of political and religious domination. The ordeal also left behind a cultural residue of fear, one that outlasted the practice itself. The peasants who witnessed ordeals grew up in a world where pain and suffering were bound to truth. Generations raised in such an atmosphere inherited a subconscious expectation that justice is brutal, that proof requires blood, that innocence demands suffering. This cultural scar would play its part in shaping later historical events. From the witch hunts of early modern Europe to the brutal inquisitions that sought truth not through reason, but through torment and fear. And then, there is the most paradoxical legacy of all, faith in the miraculous. Despite their cruelty, ordeals kept alive the idea that miracles were possible, that the divine could intervene in the most desperate circumstances. The innocent peasant spared by fire or the wrongly accused woman who survived drowning became proof that the universe could bend in favor of the just. In an age without science to explain anomalies, the miraculous survival of even one accused person confirmed to entire villages that God still walked among them. That belief, that in the darkest hour, a higher power may yet deliver salvation, has never fully disappeared from human culture. The ordeal also gave rise to literary traditions that would shape Western imagination for centuries. Medieval romances are filled with echoes of trial by combat, with knights proving their honor not through debate, but through sword and shield, their victory framed as a sign of divine favor. The trope of the hero surviving fire, crossing boiling rivers, or defeating impossible odds all carry the symbolic weight of ordeal trials. Even modern storytelling, from courtroom dramas to epic fantasy tales, is haunted by this legacy, where suffering and trial reveal truth, and justice is proven not by evidence alone, but through ordeal-like struggle. But the legacy of ordeals is not simply confined to literature or memory. It shaped the very evolution of law. When ordeal trials were abolished, societies did not simply abandon the need for divine judgment. They replaced it with systems of proof and evidence. The transition from ordeal to rational justice was not abrupt. It was slow, painful, and uncertain. Yet it was the ordeal that forced the change. Its failures, its injustices, its inability to truly separate innocence from guilt. These cracks compelled medieval thinkers and church authorities to search for alternatives. In this way, the ordeal, by collapsing under its own weight, gave birth to the foundations of modern legal systems. Still, there is an eerie sense in which ordeals never truly died. Even in the modern world, shadows of their logic persist. Think of the trial by media, where the accused is judged in the public eye long before evidence is examined. Think of the ritualized humiliation of suspects, paraded before cameras in handcuffs, their guilt or innocence left to the spectacle of public opinion. Think of the soldiers or leaders who justify wars as God's will, invoking divine judgment upon enemies. These are not ordeals in the literal sense, but they bear the same cultural DNA, the need for visible suffering, the hunger for spectacle, the invocation of higher powers in the pursuit of justice. The ordeal's legacy also lingers in rituals of courage and endurance. From hazing practices to military training, the idea that truth or worth is proven through pain still dominates many human traditions. When a soldier is told that suffering builds honor, when an initiate is told they must endure pain to prove loyalty, the logic is the same as the ordeal, that only through torment can truth be revealed. These echoes remind us that though the fires and waters of medieval Europe have gone cold, their spirit still burns quietly in the fabric of human behavior. And so, the ordeal haunts us, not as a forgotten relic, but as a ghost embedded in our very culture. Its rituals live on in the way we tell stories, in the way we seek justice, in the way we respond to suffering. The ordeal taught humanity to see pain as revelation, to see suffering as proof, to see justice as spectacle. And even now, centuries later, we struggle to escape its shadow. But what if this legacy was more deliberate than accidental? What if the ordeal did not simply fade, but was carefully transformed into new rituals, new institutions, new ways of controlling the human mind? For as the ordeal gave way to more rational systems of justice, those in power discovered new forms of trial, subtler, quieter, but just as binding. Trials no longer relied on fire and water, but on bureaucracy and law, on surveillance and reputation. The ordeal may have been outlawed, but did its essence ever truly die? Or did it simply change masks, waiting to return in new and unexpected forms? Chapter 19. The slow decline of ordeals that by the 13th century, the ordeal stood at a crossroads. For centuries, fire and water had carried the weight of divine judgment, and trial by combat had thrilled and terrified communities across Europe. Yet beneath the surface, doubts had begun to grow, doubts that would slowly corrode the very foundations of ordeal justice until, piece by piece, it collapsed into history. The decline of ordeals was neither swift nor simple. It unfolded gradually, a dance of theology, politics, and culture where faith and reason clashed, and human beings began to ask, can we truly see God's judgment in fire and blood? The first seeds of doubt were sown in the intellectual ferment of the early Middle Ages. Theologians, long defenders of the ordeal, began to worry about its implications. If God always intervened to protect the innocent, why did so many trials end in death or ruin for those later thought to be blameless? Were human beings presuming too much by forcing God to act on command? The ordeal, once considered the purest test of divine justice, began to look dangerously close to tempting God, demanding a miracle rather than respecting divine will. This theological discomfort, whispered at first, would soon become a thunderous challenge at the same time. Practical doubts gnawed at the ordeal's legitimacy. Communities had witnessed countless cases where outcomes were ambiguous or unjust. What if the accused survived the water but died weeks later of infection? What if a nobleman won trial by combat not because he was righteous, but because he was stronger, richer, or simply luckier? Such questions eroded confidence, especially among scholars and reform-minded clerics who sought a more rational, consistent form of justice. The decisive blow, however, came in 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, one of the most significant church gatherings of the medieval world. Under Pope Innocent III, the council declared that clergy were forbidden from participating in ordeals. This was not a minor adjustment. It was a thunderclap that shook the entire system. For centuries, priests had been essential to the ordeal, blessing the iron, sanctifying the water, invoking God's judgment. Without the church's ritual sanction, ordeals lost their sacred authority. What had once been divine drama now looked like little more than superstition. This papal decision did not outlaw ordeals outright, but it stripped them of legitimacy. Secular courts, left without clerical blessing, began to search for alternatives. Slowly, a new emphasis on written testimony, oaths, and witness accounts emerged. The jury system, in its early, tentative form, began to grow. Justice was shifting away from spectacle and toward deliberation, away from fire and water and toward words and evidence. Yet ordeals did not vanish overnight. In rural villages, far from centers of power, people clung to old traditions. Fear and faith are not so easily displaced by edicts from Rome. Peasants still believed in the power of God to speak through fire and combat. Local lords, eager to maintain their authority, allowed ordeals to continue well into the 13th and even 14th centuries. In some regions, especially in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, ordeals lingered stubbornly, their rituals adapted and reinterpreted, until the encroaching tide of modernity finally swept them away. But while the rituals survived in scattered corners, the cultural mood was shifting. The rise of universities, the revival of Roman law, and the spread of literacy fostered a new confidence in human reason. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas argued that divine providence worked through natural order, not through forced miracles. Legal scholars, inspired by classical models, sought consistency and rationality rather than spectacle. Slowly, painfully, the ordeal began to look less like justice and more like a relic of barbarism. The decline of ordeals also reflected broader social transformations. Medieval Europe was becoming more urbanized, more interconnected, more bureaucratic. Cities with growing populations needed systems of justice that were predictable, repeatable, and efficient. The ordeal, with its reliance on spectacle and chance, could not meet these demands. The jury, the judge, the written record, these became the new tools of order in a world increasingly shaped by trade, politics, and administration. Yet the decline of ordeals was not merely a triumph of reason over superstition. It was also a story of power. By weakening the ordeal, the Church asserted greater control over justice, redirecting authority away from local lords and toward ecclesiastical courts. Monarchs, too, seized the opportunity, centralizing justice under royal authority. What replaced the ordeal was not necessarily more humane. Torture, inquisitions, and ruthless legal systems often filled the void, but it was more controlled, more disciplined, more firmly in the hands of those who ruled. Still, even as ordeals disappeared from courtrooms, they survived in the imagination. Folk tales continued to speak of heroes tested by fire, of innocence vindicated by miraculous survival, of champions who fought duels for honor. The ordeal, once a lived reality, became a metaphor, a symbol for struggle, trial, and judgment. This metaphorical life would prove as enduring, if not more so, than the ordeal's legal existence. The slow decline of ordeals, then, was not simply the end of a practice. It was a turning point in the history of justice. It marked the moment when Europe began to turn away from divine spectacle and toward human reason, when law became less about miracles and more about evidence. And yet, even as ordeals faded, their shadow lingered, shaping how societies thought about truth, guilt, and judgment. For in the end, ordeals never truly disappeared. They transformed, evolved, and resurfaced in new guises. The fire and water may have been extinguished, but the hunger for spectacle, the belief in suffering as proof, the longing for divine judgment, these remained, haunting justice across the centuries. And as Europe entered the turbulent centuries of the Renaissance and Reformation, new forms of ordeal would rise again, no longer sanctioned by church or law, but fueled by hysteria, fear, and the dark hunger for scapegoats. For while the medieval ordeal may have declined, a new and terrifying chapter was about to begin, the age of witch hunts and inquisitions, where trial by ordeal returned in spirit, cloaked in new rituals of terror. Chapter 20: Witch Hunts and the Return of Ordeal Logic. The decline of ordeals should have been the end of divine judgment through suffering. By the 13th century, the Church had forbidden clergy from participating, courts had begun shifting toward juries and testimony, and Europe seemed to be inching toward reason. And yet, history is rarely a straight line. What dies in one form often returns in another, wearing new clothes, reshaped by fear. So it was with the ordeal that in the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe found itself convulsed by paranoia, war, famine, and plague. Communities lived in the shadow of religious upheaval, Protestant and Catholic clashing violently, monarchies rising and falling, neighbors suddenly viewed as enemies. In such turbulent times, suspicion flourished, and once again, human beings turned to trials of fire, water, and torment to separate the guilty from the innocent. The targets, however, were no longer thieves or oath-breakers. They were witches. The witch hunts that swept across Europe were, in many ways, ordeals reborn. Though the medieval trial by fire and combat had declined, the logic behind them remained intact. That suffering reveals truth, that survival signals innocence, and that God's judgment can be forced into the open. In village after village, across Germany, France, England, and Scotland, women, and sometimes men, were accused of consorting with the devil. How could one prove such a hidden crime? Once again, communities turned to spectacle. The ordeal of water reappeared in the infamous witch dunkings. An accused woman would be bound and thrown into a river or pond. If she floated, it was taken as a sign of guilt, for the pure water of baptism was thought to reject her unholy body. If she sank, she was considered innocent, though often at the cost of her life. This cruel test, so strikingly reminiscent of the medieval cold water ordeal, became a chilling theater of fear. Crowds gathered at riversides, waiting to see whether the accused would rise or fall, whether God's justice would be revealed in bubbles and ripples. Other ordeals, too, resurfaced in twisted forms. The ordeal of fire returned, in which trials where women were forced to grasp red-hot irons, or where their flesh was pricked with needles in search of the devil's mark. If they did not bleed, if they did not cry out, they were considered guilty. Pain became evidence. Silence became proof. The courtroom once again became a stage for ritualized torment. Inquisitors and magistrates, empowered by church and state, wielded these ordeals not merely as tests of guilt, but as tools of terror. Torture chambers echoed with screams as suspects were stretched on racks, crushed with weights, burned with flames. Confessions extracted under agony were considered proof, even when absurd. Flying through the night, feasting with demons, conjuring storms. The ordeal had evolved from divine spectacle into bureaucratic horror, but its essence remained unchanged. The belief that truth could be forced out of the body, that God's judgment could be revealed through pain. The psychology of these trials was as important as their brutality. Villages plagued by famine or disease needed explanations, scapegoats. When cows failed to give milk, when hailstorms destroyed crops, when children fell ill, whispers began, someone must be to blame. Fear searched for a face, and suspicion fell upon the vulnerable, widows, the poor, the different, the strange. Accusation became contagious. One whispered charge led to another, until entire communities convulsed in hysteria. The heart of this frenzy was the same hunger that had fueled ordeals centuries earlier, the desire for certainty in an uncertain world. People wanted proof, tangible and dramatic, that justice had been served, that evil had been confronted. And so the ordeal, though officially dead, lived on in the pyres of witches, in the drowning pools, in the racks and gallows. It was ordeal justice without the blessing of priests, but with the same unshakable conviction that God spoke through suffering. The scale of the witch hunts was staggering. In parts of Germany, entire towns were consumed by accusations. In Scotland, women were dragged from their homes to face swimming tests. In France, inquisitors conducted mass trials, condemning dozens in a single sweep. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, tens of thousands were executed across Europe. Each execution was a ritual, each confession a spectacle, each burning a grim echo of the old ordeal by fire. And yet, just as before, doubt eventually crept in. By the late 17th century, voices of skepticism grew louder. Philosophers and jurists began to question the logic of torture, the reliability of confessions wrung from agony, the fairness of drowning tests. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and evidence, struck at the foundations of ordeal thinking. Slowly, witch trials waned. Courts grew embarrassed by their excesses. Communities began to see hysteria where once they had seen devils. The decline of witch hunts mirrored the earlier decline of medieval ordeals. Both rose in times of fear, flourished when certainty was scarce, and fell when reason demanded a higher standard of proof. Both reveal the deep human need to transform chaos into order, suspicion into spectacle, fear into ritual. And both, in the end, crumbled under the weight of their own cruelty and irrationality. But even in their decline, ordeals left a powerful legacy. The word itself, ordeal, still carries echoes of fire, water, and trial. We speak of life's hardships as ordeals, of personal struggles as tests of fire. The metaphor lives on because the logic of ordeal is etched deep into human culture. The belief that suffering reveals truth, that endurance proves worth, that justice is forged in pain. The story of ordeals, from medieval courts to witch hunts, is not simply the story of superstition giving way to reason. It is the story of humanity's ongoing struggle to understand guilt and innocence, to find certainty where none exists. Even today, the shadow of ordeal lingers. We may no longer cast people into rivers or force them to grasp hot iron, but in subtler ways, we still demand proof through suffering. Public shaming, relentless interrogations, the idea that innocence must be proven rather than presumed. These are the modern descendants of ordeal thinking. And so, as we close this journey, one lesson remains. Ordeals were not merely medieval rituals. They were mirrors of human fear, human hope, and human cruelty. They remind us that justice, when twisted by desperation, can become indistinguishable from torment. And they challenge us to ask, in our own world, with our own rituals of judgment, have we truly escaped the shadow of the ordeal?